This is a video about the JAMstack, a way of developing and deploying sites to the web. I've been building things with JAMstack for quite a long time. I think actually before the term JAMstack was around, and I've become really excited about the possibilities of using JAMstack and what it can do for us as developers and also for users as well. So this is quite a long video. I go into a little bit of depth. We start with an introduction to what the JAMstack is, what the term is, what it means, and then also some of the advantages of the JAMstack. We compare it a little bit to other stacks like the LAMP stack, which is something that might be a bit more familiar to many web developers. And then we'll start to look through a bunch of examples. So there are 6 examples kind of practically showing taking one site from a single file, a statically generated or statically written with my own hands HTML file, deploying that to a content delivery network, but then evolving that page, turning it into something a little bit more dynamic, turning it into something that has things like localization and client-side rendering and other bits and pieces. And so that's a set of examples that grows throughout the video. You can jump into any of those points and jump straight into those examples, or you can watch the kind of evolution of the whole thing as we go. And then at the end of the video, as we do a little bit of a wrap up, there's also another demonstration which looks at how you can start to use the JAMstack in your own infrastructure. So if you're already building sites using a different architecture, how can you add JAMstack next to that? What's an easy route in to do that? So there's an example of that at the end as well. At the end of the video, there are also a bunch of resources and links for you to take a look at, and I hope it's useful. So let's get started and start to look at exactly what this JAMstack thing is. Right then, so where to begin? Well, if we're thinking about an introduction to the JAMstack, then it's probably worth our while just considering that this is an approach to delivering websites. And it's not the only one. There are many, many approaches to delivering websites. We've been at this a long time now as an industry, and we've evolved a long way. It used to be when we first started out, this is an incredibly nice, simple diagram to begin with. It used to be that when we started building for the web, we'd create assets, we'd put them on a web server, and then we'd come along in a browser and we'd ask for stuff, and then we'd get the stuff. And that's a lovely situation to be in. It seems very simple, very straightforward. We'd have this relationship where we'd create assets, put them somewhere that they'd become available, and then when someone came along with a web browser and asked for those resources, we'd simply deliver them to them. And that was great, and it stood up well for quite a while, and that was kind of nice and efficient. But we soon ran into limitations in that these things were kind of they were static. They weren't able to be changed based on what people asked for. So the experiences we were getting seemed to be quite static as well. So we tried to add something new to this. We started to add some kind of level of dynamism at the server level. So now instead of just asking for stuff and getting stuff, the server would do stuff as well. We'd have this script, this logic that would be executed at the server level for every request that would generate a view and then return it to the user. And that was great because it meant that as we were requesting things, we could build things up on the fly. So we wouldn't need to know every permutation that was being requested or we might need in ahead of time. We could respond to the needs of the user and create something dynamically and return it. But it did mean that the responsibilities of this server now were quite different. Now we needed to make sure that for every request that came in, we had enough capacity here, enough horsepower to be able to service every request and get something back to them quickly. So that soon led to a slightly different scenario. So we started to introduce different bits of infrastructure. So rather than just having a single web server that was creating those views, we started to add many web servers to handle the traffic. And we'd perhaps put something in front of those web servers, like a load balancer that would say, okay, well, this request will go to this web server, this request will go to another web server, kind of share the load across those servers. And we started to do more things like abstract where the data lived, rather than the data being on these web servers as well. We started to say, well, let's abdicate the responsibility and share some of the load with servers that are specific to that, and abstract those out as well. So we got to a point that a request from a page from a user for a page would travel through all of these different bits of infrastructure, gradually assembling a view that would get returned to the user into the browser rather than having something ready to go. We also started to think about, well, maybe we could find some assets that are kind of just static and don't need generating on the fly, and maybe we could put those in a different location. So we started to introduce things like a CDN, which is a content delivery network, a network of machines geographically arranged so that wherever the user arrives from, some of those assets can be served directly from there, whereas others would have to go through this journey and get built up over time. So all of this kind of added to the infrastructure and to the pieces in play for serving the request of a user. In short, it got complicated, and we got more sophisticated in the kind of things we're building, and our infrastructure got more complicated as a result. Luckily, though, we've been learning and we've been building new tools, so we don't have to stay in this same picture that we've had for such a long time. We understand that the needs of users have changed and what we expect to build has changed, but so has the tooling that allows us to get there. So a few things have changed. Browsers have got more capable. The web browser that you'll be viewing this site in now is very different to the one that we were using at the beginning when everything was a little bit simpler. Browsers are way more powerful, way more capable than they ever used to be, and we can use those to great effect. Also, as a consequence of building so many sites for such a long time, we as an industry have matured our processes. We've really got a lot better at the way that we build sites and the way that we can deploy them, so we can start to take advantage of these maturing processes. And also, tooling has improved. The things that enable us to generate our code, to manage our code, to deploy our code, and all of the things around that's all improved as well. So we can evolve our approach as a result of all of these things improving. So let's get to this small question then, since we're looking at an introduction to JAMstack. What is the JAMstack? Well, there's a couple of ways that we could answer that. We could ask, what does JAMstack stand for? And we could ask, well, what does JAMstack mean? And at first glance, you think, well, these are the same question, but not quite. Let's dig into both of them. In terms of what does JAMstack stand for, well, the word has come about by considering JavaScript, APIs, and markup to make up the jam of this JAMstack. And certainly, as we go through this video, we'll look at how we use markup, how we use JavaScript, and how we use APIs to create experiences in the browser. But there's more to it than just what it stands for. Let's also consider the word stack as well for just a moment. What do we mean by stack in the first place? Well, I think when we're talking about where web technology stacks, the stack is the layer of technology which technologies which deliver the website or application. It's the set of tools that make up that delivery. So when we think about what it stands for, well, that's one thing, but I don't think we're any the wiser necessarily to talk about what does JAMstack actually mean and what's the result and how do we use it. This is about the best definition I think I've encountered of JAMstack, and that is JAMstack means fast and secure sites and apps delivered by pre-rendering files and serving them directly from a CDN, removing the requirement to manage or run web servers. There's a lot to unpack there, and we'll do that over the course of this video, but I think this is a good descriptive meaning for JAMstack, pre-rendering the files so that you don't need to manage a web server later on. It's kind of a return to the capabilities that we might have had in this world, but there's so much more that's come along to empower things around this that we'll get to shortly. You might think, well, there are a lot of stacks already. I'm aware of different approaches of building things for the web. There are all of these different stacks that we might choose from with different technologies, and that's fair. But let's use one of them as a bit of an example, just as for means of clarification and a bit of comparison. So let's talk about LAMPstack for a little while. Now, LAMPstack that stands for Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP, and this is a very popular, I think the most popular combination of technologies for building out a web experience that exists on the web at the moment. And each of these technologies plays a certain role, and these other stacks that we've listed up here, effectively that plays into the same kind of environment, but some of these technologies are switched out. But ultimately, they do the same kind of thing. We end up with a system where on a web server where we've got something that is delivering our operating system for us to build on in the first place. We've got a layer for data access, being MySQL here for a database and the services attributed to that. Then we've got a layer for doing pre-processing, or the actual scripting and processing and handling of the logic and assembling the views. In this case, it's PHP for that pre-processing layer. And then some kind of web server that will do things like the HTTP routing and the actual serving of assets and passing things along down the stack to get the resources we need. Now, in the LAMP stack, you'll often find these things combined in a single web server, but over time, as load increases, a typical thing to do is we won't have one web server, we'll have many web servers all running these bits and pieces. And as I described a few minutes ago, sometimes we'll start to abstract things like the data layer out of these, but ultimately we're still looking at a stack which reaches all the way back down to the operating system, right the way through up to the actual routing and the handling of the HTTP requests. Meanwhile, if we were to look at the JAMstack as a comparison to that, the stack looks quite different. The diagram's a little bit different here, but we're catering for the same kind of things. We're still talking about HTTP routing and serving. We're still talking about data access. We're still talking about kind of processing and a runtime. But the key difference here is that this runtime, the processing layer, in effect, the operating system, if you like, that lives within the browser here. So we're not having to reach all the way down into an operating system. That's provided to us by the client. That's the runtime exists right there in the browser. The APIs, the data access, we've kind of abstracted that away. That's kind of not part of our domain now. There are APIs that exist out in the ecosystem now that we can make use of, which we don't have to manage ourselves. We can request access to those via their APIs. And we typically do that using JavaScript. So that's why we get this this kind of trinity of markup, delivering content, and then if needed, we can start to use JavaScript in the browser to talk to APIs and get content and embellish and enhance the experience here in the browser. There's still routing and serving going on, but typically in a JAMstack world, what we're doing is we're pre-generating all of those assets. They can be served from a very simple static server, or even better still, a CDN. And this is the kind of thing that can be managed for us. It's almost like a service that's been completely abstracted away, since there's no internal kind of clever logic here, which is coupled to the way that our system, our application works. So markup, JavaScript, and APIs have kind of moved the stack kind of away from the server and over here. So JAMstack really is about having things that are pre-rendered. It's about leveraging the browser and the power in the browser and the technologies available to us in the browser. And it's about operating without a web server. And all of these things bring us a bunch of different advantages. We'll get onto that in a second, but I just want to kind of put these two things side by side for a second and consider what the stack looks like here and the depth of the stack that reaches all the way down to the operating system, right the way up through the data, the scripting, and even the handling of the requests. And compare that over here to what happens with the JAMstack, where the stack has kind of moved up a level. It's kind of closer to the browser. It's closer to the user. We're not dealing with operating system infrastructure. We're dealing with a runtime which is provided to us in the browser so that we can use JavaScript right there to do the dynamic things we need right there in the browser and sitting on top of markup and being able to call APIs. So this means that if we're thinking about pre-rendering things, working without a web server, it feels like we're getting a bit closer back to this kind of environment, this kind of flow where we're pre-generating things, putting them somewhere that they can be found, and then a request comes from a user to get the stuff, and they get that back. This kind of return to this simplicity
was starting to get appreciated quite a long time ago. Aaron Swartz has done a lot for the open web and a lot for web development in general. Kind of coined this term. He talked about bake, don't fry in a blog post that he wrote back in 2002, where his instincts were to trying to get back to a place of more simplicity where things could be much more robust if only we could find a way to get to this point where we were not building our response to a request every time, frying it on demand, but instead baking it ahead of time so it's ready to return. And this idea of pre-rendering that we're talking about and having things ready to go for when they're requested, there are lots of reasons we might have motives for that. I think about it as doing the work now so your servers don't have to do it later, kind of lightening the load and the complexity at request time and doing this work up front. I also like to think of putting some distance between the complexity and the user. Again, thinking about this world where perhaps we're having to have moving parts at all of these stages when a request comes from a user, knowing that with confidence all of these things will work perfectly every time and the transmission between these things is going to work perfectly every time. There's some complexity and potential failure points there, and the more we can reduce those and the more we can put distance between the user and that complexity, the better. And we'll talk about how we put that distance between those two things shortly. Being in a situation where we have a much simplified kind of hosting scenario where we've got pre-generated assets, this hugely simplifies deployments. And I want to just kind of illustrate that point just a tiny bit. So I've kind of adapted our diagram from earlier where we've got a request in a traditional stack that's maybe hitting a CDN but also hitting a load balancer, web server, database servers, and the request goes through all of these things. When we're talking about our development and our deployment of our code and our content, well, that requires action being taken and updates happening to each of these bits of infrastructure. Sometimes there are many of these bits of infrastructure next to each other. And so as we're deploying and developing and deploying our code, we need to make sure that we can predictably update all of these things and they all stay in lockstep so that the result is always going to be something predictable. If we compare that to the situation with the JAMstack, where everything is pre-generated and ready to go as a content delivery network, it means that our process of development and deployment, that's radically simplified. That is a situation where we're essentially updating one resource in a known and predictable way. This unlocks all kinds of opportunities for us, and one of those things is that we can start to use version control for everything. Now, yes, it's fair to say that we might want to do that in this environment as well, and of course we do. But when we're in a situation where we're building a known asset and putting that one set of assets in a single place, it means that we can start leveraging things like version control and tools like Git, which we'll come to in a little while, and start using that in our examples. We can have the version control used for everything, right down to the configuration of how the CDN works, right through to all of our content, all of the code. And then that version control can reach all the way through to the hosting environment and through to the deployment process, so that we have a very predictable way of updating and deploying our code. There are a few other advantages of JAMstack that I think are really important to call out. And those are security, performance, and scale. And I'll just spend a couple of minutes just describing those just in short. So in terms of security, well, how does the JAMstack improve our outlook for security for websites? Well, as you might imagine from the diagrams we've just seen, we get a greatly reduced surface area when we're working with the JAMstack. If we think about this comparison once again, the kind of infrastructure we have in play and the kind of infrastructure we need to secure, even against the requests that we know are going to have to pass through all of this infrastructure and have code that executes in all of these different environments. The more infrastructure we have and the more moving parts and the more code we have, the more we have to secure. Simply put, with the JAMstack, there are fewer moving parts in the scenario. I can sometimes glibly kind of comment about the fact that there is no server more secure than the one that doesn't exist. So getting some of this infrastructure and these moving parts out of our hosting scenario just creates a much more manageable security profile for us. There are far fewer moving parts to attack. Moving on to performance, well, when we think about how we've tried to handle performance in our traditional stack, the kind of stack that I've been illustrating, well, often what we'll do when we're trying to build out that kind of hosting environment to be very performant and to respond to requests quickly, is we'll start to add some static layers to that. And what I'm talking about there is I'm talking about caching. So if we go back to our diagram once again, at each level of the stack, in order to try and speed up the process of this request passing all the way through the infrastructure and back, at every level we try and minimize the dynamic things we have to do here. So a web server, we might look at, well, what templates are commonly used with what data, and can we cache that response so it's ready to go when a request comes into it. That reaches down as well into things like the databases, where we might try and cache common queries for the data. So a request that comes in there actually isn't doing something dynamic. It's saying, this is a common request, so I can serve that statically and return that much more quickly. That's true at every level through, right through to the CDN, where some assets are cached, but some of them will need to be refreshed and updated. If we compare that with a JAMstack, every time we do a deployment into our CDN, effectively we are updating the entire serving cache. There is no logic that we have to manage, this barrier between what is cached and what needs to be dynamic. And it's this logical separation at each level that adds complexity and adds complication to how we deploy and manage and maintain these bits of infrastructure. Caching is hard. Caching is one of those things that's universally understood to be hard in web development. The more you can simplify the model of the cache and ideally have something that takes care of that for you wholesale, the better off we'll be. But it's also interesting to note that, for all of the benefits we might sometimes hear about for a dynamic backend, the way we try and make it go fast is adding static layers into it. And this is again an area that we'll kind of think about a bit later on when we talk about what truly is dynamic and what truly is static. Let's move on to scale. So when we're talking about scale, we're talking about how many requests can we manage with a particular piece of infrastructure. Traditional stacks add infrastructure in order to cope with large scale. In a previous life, I worked doing technical architectures for large projects, and it was always a tough question to answer how much will our infrastructure cost for this project, because we kind of just needed to know, well, how much traffic are we going to get, and also how complex is it going to be for us to handle each of those requests, and as a result, how much infrastructure will we need? Adding infrastructure to include to handle scale looks a bit like this. I mean, certainly adding these caching layers, that's going to help to a degree, because that lightens the load on what needs to be dynamically that work that needs to be dynamically done. But knowing that there's going to be more and more traffic here at each of these levels, the result is that we start to add more bandwidth in. We start to add more servers, more capability, more capacity rather, to handle this increased load. More servers means more cost, more complexity. Our deployments are getting more complex as we manage things across here. And this is just catering for a live environment. We're not even talking about things like staging and testing environments, where we really, strictly speaking, we should be replicating all of these. So this is a different scenario to the JAMstack, where by design and by default, the JAMstack, where everything is already cached, there's no additional dynamic work to do, this kind of on-demand work to do. So we're at an optimal position already, serving everything from a content delivery network, which from its very inception was designed to handle things at high load. That's exactly what they're for. So we've got a much better scenario over here if we can work in this way. Okay, that sounds fine, but you might be raising an eyebrow and thinking, well, okay, but what you're describing is a return to this, and I thought this was a problem, because everything had to be, we're hand making all of these assets and putting them there, and we don't know how to service things that are a little bit more custom or dynamic. Well, that's a fair thing to call out and a common point of concern. But luckily, the whole reason that Jamstack exists and the whole reason this term really exists is we've moved on. We're lucky that we've got this experience now. We've been building and learning about new approaches and new tools. So things have evolved. We're not quite in the same scenario we were before. And I tend to think of it as having all of these enablers. Yes, we used to think of things in this world as static sites. That word isn't going to cut it anymore. Things aren't static in the same way at all anymore. There are benefits from hosting things in this way, but we've really evolved. The tools and the systems have evolved. I think of it in terms of enablers. We've got all of these enablers now that allow us to go far beyond what we used to do, and that's what the Jamstack is all about. So there are enablers, things such as static site generators. Now, a static site generator is a script, if you like, which effectively does the work that we used to do in a web server here. We used to have templates and data and logic, and when a request would come in, we'd munge those through all of those things and generate a view and return it. Well, a static site generator includes all of those things, but rather than happening at request time, this happens at build time. So we can generate all of the resources that we need for an entire site by running a script ahead of time. That kind of brings me to tooling and automation, because it's kind of one aspect of that. There are all kinds of resources now for how we automate the process of generating our sites, how we trigger those things, how we predictably deploy and manage the assets, and the tooling and the automation that has arrived in the industry now really elevates the kind of sites that we can build and the way we build it. And that's what we're going to look at just a little bit as we get into our examples in a few minutes. The other thing that really has become a huge enabler is the development in browsers. Web browsers are so much more capable now than they ever were before. Now, this doesn't mean that we just offload all of the work and all of the complexity from the back end into the front end. Certainly, we can do more than we've ever done before, but there are techniques for progressively enhancing the experience in the browser and responsibly building up layer upon layer of functionality and dynamism in the browser, and we can leverage all kinds of smart things at the browser level that we just didn't have access to before. And the last, and perhaps one of the largest enablers, I think, for the Jamstack is the number of services and APIs, and the API economy has really flourished. We're starting now to see companies emerge with all kinds of specialisms, the kind of things that we used to have to build in-house with our own team. Now companies are starting to see the opportunities of creating those capabilities and offering them as a service and offering access to them through APIs, so that we can predictably request access to those and get the kind of capabilities that we need to bring into our sites. So with all of these things together, this really elevates the kind of sites that we can build from what we used to think of as static, but now can do so much more because of all of these things. So over the course of the next, couple of hours, we're going to look at a bunch of examples, and it's going to start super simple. We're going to start with something which very much is in this territory. But then over the course of the examples, we'll build up, we'll start to introduce static site generators, we'll look at some of the tooling and automation. We are going to start to do things directly in the browser and start to call on browser APIs, and then also use JavaScript in the browsers to call on services that exist out there in the world and bring in content from different APIs and different services that exist there. So that's a brief introduction to what the Jamstack is and where we're going to go. And now I think we'll get into some examples. I'm a tiny bit conscious that this is a long video, and I've got 7 examples to show you. So depending on what you're looking for, you might want to jump right the way in directly to some of those examples. Now these do follow a particular pattern. They do follow a bit of a journey. We'll start with something very simple, and we'll use the same example to gradually build up. So to get the full story, you'll probably want to watch each of those in turn. However, if you want to jump straight in, I've just put this little index page here so you can see the approximate times of when to jump into each section. So it starts with a very simple static site, a single file being being created and deployed. But this does look at the simplest way of deploying the site, not just making it. So that's kind of why that's there and important. Then on top of that, we start to add some simple JavaScript rendering to that example. We'll start manipulating things in the client. Then after we've done that, we'll move down to building that site with a static site generator. So we'll start to use some kind of templating and abstraction and how the mechanics of that work, and then some automation there. And we'll do that so that then our next example number 4, we'll start to populate that site and that static site, the site built with this static site generator, with content from an API, and we'll be doing that at build time. From there, we'll go on and we'll start using the content API to also render out lots of different versions of the site with different localized content, and start to configure our content delivery network to route people to the appropriate route based on their location in the world. Then after that, in example 6, we'll start to add a bit more client-side rendering and start to target content to the visitor of the site based on some JavaScript we'll run in the front end. So we'll start to interact with the browser APIs and then do some client-side requests to other content APIs to do some progressive enhancement of that page through some client-side rendering. So those are the examples we're going to work through and the time codes that you have with them. Then at the end, I couldn't help myself. I added just another bonus piece of demonstration to think about how we gradually introduce a JAMstack site into your existing infrastructure. So if you have complex infrastructure already and you think, well, I'd like to start using the JAMstack, but how do I introduce the two and blend the two together? This is the time when you can find an example of how we can do that using some of the tools that we'll see along the way, but ultimately it's a quick look at how we can start to introduce a JAMstack site into and around your existing hosting infrastructure. So that's the rundown of the demos we'll get into and the times that you can access those. Okay, so I think it's time for an example. Let's jump into one or two examples, and we're going to start nice and simple. Let's not go crazy to start off with. Let's just start super simple, and we'll build up over time. One of the things that we'll do through each of these examples is the code is going to be, you can follow along as I write some of this, but also I'll pop this onto a GitHub repository so you can grab the code and step through it as well. Now this first one that I'm starting with is very simple, so you might not be so inclined to do it, but let's start with the same conventions we're going to use throughout. So each of the repositories is going to be available at a URL like this. So find that at jamstack/x1, for example. Number 1, that's where this is going to be. And this example, we're starting just very simply and with a very simple static site. Let's just look again, just as a bit of a reminder about, what is JAMstack? What is this thing we're going to make? And just as a bit of a refresher, we're just saying that JAMstack is fast and secure sites and apps delivered by pre-rendering files and serving them directly from a CDN, which removes the requirement to manage and run web servers. Great. So what we're going to do is we're going to pre-render, which is a bit of a fancy word really for what we're doing. We're going to just make an HTML file that will then host directly from a CDN so that we don't have to bother with Apache or Nginx or other kind of web servers. It should be nice and simple. What are the things we're going to make? Well, I've given it away just by saying we're just going to make HTML, so we're just going to make markup. But as a reminder, JAMstack is JavaScript, APIs, and markup. But it doesn't have to be all three. It can be any one of these. I mean, critically, I guess markup is the minimum viable site you can have. Browsers interpret HTML, they interpret markup and do things with them, even if that markup then calls in JavaScript and then makes use of APIs or what have you. But to start with, I think we'll just make some markup and we'll put that somewhere that can be served as a JAMstack site. So just a tiny look again at what this could look like. This is the thing we're about to do. We're going to build something. Now, later on, as this gets more advanced, we'll be building things. We'll be using tooling to be building this. We'll be using some automation. We'll perhaps use a static site generator. For the moment, we're going to, I'm just going to be mashing a keyboard and making a file that will then deploy to some hosting somewhere, so it can go onto a content delivery network, a set of servers around the world that we don't need to manage. It's managed as a service, but then it'll give us a URL so that we can request this page in our browser, get the markup, which we don't have to do anything because that's all been pre-built. It'll come down the wire, and our browser will then be able to display that to us. That sounds like I'm maybe overcomplicating things or being very flowery with my description, given what we're about to do. But these are the principles that we'll build on over time. So let's jump into making something. We're just going to make a very simple static view of a page first of all. And I've got a folder set up here which I think is empty. Yeah, great. So let's just start coding something. Now I love this because it kind of harks back to the things that I was doing as I started to get into web development. I was opening up text editors, writing code. Now, admittedly, I didn't have lots of helpers like this, which is lovely, being able to have helpers such as that to speed some of these things up. But ultimately, writing code in text editors and then refreshing the browser to see the result, I used to love that. So this kind of makes me reminisce about that. But let's get on with this, and let's make a page for you. We're going to gradually get to the point that we customize this and make this a bit personalized. To start with, it's going to be super simple though. I am going to make a little wrapper so I can do some like centering and bits and bobs like that. We'll put an H1 in there and say this is a page for you. Let me capitalize that. And let's put something in here that maybe we'll customize a bit later on. Let's make this nice and positive. We'll put some love in here. Oop. Fine. Maybe we should style this up a little bit. I'm just going to do this all in line, I think, rather than creating some CSS files that I'll call in. I'll split that out later on, but for the moment, really are keeping this nice and basic. Just want to align that. Oops. Yeah. What else should we do? Let's width, perhaps like say 400. And let's make that love nice and visible. Okay. Oops. Okay, so we've made something pretty simple. I think you'll agree. It's just a single file. Now we don't need a web server to serve this. This is about as basic as it can get. So I could, in fact, just open this up locally. Where did my browser go? Let's bring that over here. I don't think there's any huge surprises in what we're seeing there. It's just some static HTML being served locally from my file system. There's no Apache, there's no Nginx, there's nothing really clever going on here. It's just a file that we're serving, and as such, this makes it ideal for being able to serve as our most basic JAMstack example. Now, there's a load of different places we could perhaps go to host this. Full disclaimer, I work at Netlify, which is a company that does this sort of thing. So I'm going to use Netlify mostly just because it's most convenient, and I think it's pretty simple to get started with. But of course, there are other companies you could use for this. You could be hosting this on, say, GitHub Pages, or on site, or on Google Cloud, or directly on Amazon Web Services, maybe in an S3 bucket. But I'm just going to use this because it's a very, very simple example, very simple way to get started. And here's my directory that we just created. I just created that one index file in it. I'm just going to drag and drop that onto here. And so what's happening here is this is being deployed to a CDN. This has gone over to Netlify. Netlify have pushed it around to their different hosting infrastructure. And we've got a URL for that now. So I can look at that. We see that on this URL. Here's our page. If we did a view source, no surprises, because it's just exactly what we served. It's being what we built. it's being served statically, it's being served from a CDN. I don't have a server to maintain to keep this alive. It's just there as part of the service. So yes, that was terribly simple in terms of what we built. But let's just refresh what we've done there. Okay, so we built something. We made something just by typing rather than with any kind of build tools. We deployed it to a hosting environment, to a CDN, and then we called it up in the browser, seeing the markup there. So was that Jamstack? Let's have a quick sense check of that. Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, it's just markup, and Jamstack cites a JavaScript APIs and markup. It's a super simple example, but it's markup. It was pre-rendered. We didn't have to render anything at request time. All we were doing was serving that static asset directly from a CDN. We didn't have to manage any web servers or have any logic running there. It's effectively just serving that file. So in answer to the question, was that Jamstack? Yep, I think so. That's probably the most simple example we can have of a Jamstack site. But now we're in a position to move on and build something a bit more interesting. So let's gradually layer up with another example. So onwards to our next example, example number 2. We're going to add some JavaScript to what we had previously. Once again, the code's going to be available on GitHub, so you can just jump straight into what we have there. So that's going to be find that at JAMstack X2, since this is example number 2, and we're going to use JavaScript to make the page a little bit more interesting. We're going to keep on building on that previous example, but move it along a little bit. So we have just our markup previously. Now we're going to be adding JavaScript. At this point, we're not going to be calling any APIs. We're going to come to that a little bit later on. But as I said before, Jamstack doesn't need to use all of these things. You can use any of them. Typically, it will always include markup. But now we're just going to add some JavaScript. There are a few different things that we might do with JavaScript at different stages of the development, the deployment, and the execution time. So let's just look at that a tiny bit. And I'm going to call out this phrase rendering. So you may have heard people talking about rendering and different types of rendering. And I think we should call out a few of the main types of rendering just to explain those and unpack those terms a little bit. So here are the 3 types of rendering that I want to call out. And they come into 2 groups. There's client-side rendering and there's server-side rendering. So first of all, let's talk about client-side rendering. Let's talk about what that means. When we say client-side rendering, what we're talking about is executing JavaScript in the browser, so in the client, executing JavaScript in the browser that manipulates the DOM. So in other words, it's changing what the user sees in the document object model, the view that is rendered by the browser. So that means that this code executes not in server land, but in browser land, so that it's on the user's device, it's in their browser, it runs client-side. And that JavaScript has just come down the wire. It might be in the same page, same file as the HTML, it might be in different files and different assets, but none of it is executed on the server. This is all executing client-side in the browser. Then, if we look at the other side of rendering, looking at server-side rendering, sometimes you hear this abbreviated to SSR. There's a couple of different ways we might think about server-side rendering. There's request time and there's build time, but both of these things are happening on the server. So let's look at request time first of all. And when we're talking about server-side rendering that happens at request time, so per request, what we mean is generating the markup on request in the server and then transmitting that to the client. So let's look at a little diagram of this for just a moment. So this is familiar from the first example, but we've just changed it a little bit, because what's happening here is when the user makes a request by pointing their browser at a URL, that rather than hitting a CDN, perhaps we're hitting a web server. Now on that web server, we don't have a complete view ready to go. We're going to render that on demand as a response to that request. So on the web server, we might have maybe some templates, maybe some other logic that gets executed to determine what template we use. Maybe that calls out to data that we need to populate the template with to generate this view. That might live on the same machine. As sites get bigger, we typically split that out, so it's on a different server, so it's on a database server, so we might need to make a request for that data, then mash that together with the template to generate the view that we send down the wire to the browser for it to get displayed in the browser. Now, during build time and deployment time, we might be writing the code that is the logic templates. We might be populating data into the database for the content. So those kind of tasks are happening at build time. But the critical piece of generating that view and then returning it to the user, that is happening at request time in server-side rendering that happens at request time. So that's this scenario. The other scenario is server-side rendering build time. I sometimes talk about that as being pre-generation or site generation, but I think perhaps a more useful term is still thinking about it as server-side rendering, but this is happening at build time rather than at request time. So we talk about that as being, we generate markup at build time so that it's ready to transmit to the client when needed. So we don't need to perform this this task of compiling or generating, rendering the view per request. This is happening once at build time. So the view of that looks like the view we had previously in this diagram. So the rendering happens here at build time, and then it's deployed to wherever we're going to serve it from. So in this case, a CDN, a content delivery network, so that it's ready for every request. We don't have to do this again. It's ready to send down the wire to the user. So both in client-side rendering and in server-side rendering at build time, they share something in common, and that is that per request, we don't need to execute any logic on the server to then generate a view. These things are all ready to go. And one of the things that you sometimes might hear is with the JAMstack, the stack, the technology stack, the things where logic is executed, that's kind of moved to the browser, moved closer to the user and into the browser, because here we are executing code that will change the view and change the rendering, but that's not happening on a server. That's happening in JavaScript and in the client side. Neither one of these has a server that executes logic. So these are the two kinds of rendering that you often associate with JAMstack. So the thing that we're going to build in this next example is going to be something that does some client-side rendering. It's a very simplistic example, but we'll get into that now. So let's go over to our folder again. So we've got a new folder here for this example. If I just list what's in there. At the moment, we've just got the index.html file that we had before. Let's just open that up and refresh our memory. It was just a moment ago. But here we are. It's just our simple little HTML file. But we're going to do something here with JavaScript in the client that's going to change this view and manipulate that a little bit. So at the moment, I've got this page, which is a page just for me. It's a very motivational thing for me to see each day. But let's change this a little bit so there's something that's potentially going to be a bit dynamic. So I want to have a bit of a vibe that I get every day from this, a little message. You are great. That's the kind of motivation I need. But let's make this message change every time the user refreshes the page. So in other words, we're going to be changing what's rendered in the browser with JavaScript every time the user refreshes it. So let's create a bit of JavaScript over here to do that. Let's call that vibe.js. And what might we have in here? Well, I'm going to do some copy and pasting so you don't have to watch me type. But what we're going to do is let's set up a bunch of different messages that we might display in this div here. So at the moment, it tells me I'm great, which is all very nice. But let's have a few different messages that might get displayed to me. So yeah, these are the kind of affirmations I need to brighten my day. But we'll choose one of these at random. So I'm going to pull in, again, I'm just going to pull in the code rather than having you watch me type it. So I've set up an array of these vibes, these messages, and then I'm going to choose one at random with this bit of JavaScript that just pulls from random one of these messages, and then we're going to display that in the browser by selecting the element that has this vibe class and appending whichever one of these messages that we've selected at random. Of course, we need to call that into the page. Let's just do that down here. Oops, with the script tag. We'll source that from what did we call it? We called it vibe.js. Okay. So once again, there's nothing happening that requires a server here. This is all happening in the client. Oops, where did that open up? Let's pull it over here. Oh, I'll need to, let me just make it so you can see this. Okay. First of all, let's save that. We'll open that. Okay, so now every time we load our page, we're getting a different view or a different message here that's injected by JavaScript. Now again, this is a simple explanation, very deliberately, but what we're doing is effectively rendering some content client side. Okay, what we should probably do is get that deployed as well. So if you recall, we were, in our previous example, we had this little site being deployed. We've got one publish already, and what I'll do is I'm just going to oops. Okay, so now we have our second example here. Let's do likewise. Let's go to our deploys, and we're going to send this to the server, to the hosting as well. Okay, so now hopefully when we go to our site, okay, great. Now we have this extra message there we didn't have before, which is on the server, and each time we load the page, that's changing. Now you'll notice that this is happening at the time that I run the code in the browser. So in other words, this is happening client side. None of this is happening server side. All we're serving from the server is this HTML and this JavaScript, all of which was pre-rendered, pre-generated, and we did it manually by typing it, but it's the kind of thing that might have been something of a build output. But nonetheless, we've got some simple client-side rendering happening as a slight enhancement. And this is somewhere, again, that we'll be able to build on for our next example. So let's just recap for just a moment. You know, what have we got here? So we're manually generating some markup, and we've also written some JavaScript that comes down the wire. And then in the client, we're doing some very simple JavaScript just to manipulate the DOM and render some different content. And that's what's happening right now. So let's do our little recap. Was that JAMstack? Yep, we've got markup, we've got JavaScript, and critically, what we don't have is a web server running that we need to manage. Everything is being hosted and served directly from a CDN. So yes, indeed, that is still very much JAMstack. But now we need to start making things a little bit more interesting. So let's move on to our next example. All right, so in our next example, things are going to start to get a bit more interesting now, because in example number 3, we're going to start doing that server-side rendering at build time with some automation, rather than just typing these files that we've been doing so far. Let's start to add some scripting and some automation. So this example is building with an SSG or with a static site generator, and I'll introduce you to that in a second. The code that we're creating, as before, is going to be available in a GitHub repository. You can find that at JAMstack X3. And you'll be able to follow along with the code that we're going to create together now. Before we jump into making this and starting to write some code, let's just talk about a few prerequisites, because now we're not just editing files, we're actually starting to introduce some moving parts. So there are a few things that you'll need in order to make this work. So one of them is Git. So Git for version control. We're getting to the point that we're going to start having versions, and we're going to start incrementing through that. And later on, we're also going to start using Git for actually deploying some of these updates. So you will need to have Git installed. Many systems already have that, but you can get that for free from this URL. Also on freeCodeCamp, there is a lot of support for getting started with Git, how to use it. The other thing that we'll need to have installed is Node.js. So that's a local JavaScript engine, so you can run JavaScript client server side, or rather on your local development machine. So we're going to need to have Node.js installed. Again, it's for free, and you can get that from nodejs.org. There is a good help in getting started installing that. Should just take a few minutes to install. Once we've got those two things installed on our local machine, there's another couple of things that we're going to use for hosting the code and then deploying the code later on. We've already done something with Netlify with our drag and drop, but we're going to start using that a little bit more. It's worth creating an account so that you can track this and retain the site that you build, rather than just having something which is ephemeral. Those drag and drop deploys we did earlier on, if you don't claim those, eventually they just go away, so you just need to claim those. So an account from netlify.com is important. Likewise, an account again for free from GitHub, github.com, so that we've got somewhere to push our changes and track all of our changes. So those are the prerequisites we'll need before we get started. What we're going to do once we do get started is we're going to change. So this is our diagram from the previous example. So you may recall what we were comparing JAMstack to is these dynamic backends, these web servers which compile the view on demand for you. So in this scenario, when a request comes into the web server, we're pulling together the data we need, we're generating the HTML, and then we're outputting it at request time. Whereas with JAMstack, of course, we're not doing that here. We're doing this previously at build time. And so far, all we've been doing is just typing assets. What we're now going to do is we're going to start to add some scripting, some automation, some intelligence here. And by doing so, we're effectively creating this server-side rendering at build time. We're generating the markup at build time so that it's ready to transmit to the client when we need it. So that's what we're going to do. The way we're going to do that is we're going to have some kind of build automation. So this is a script that will run, which will pull those things together, churn out the HTML and whatever assets we need to be able to tell the browser to render the site. So we're going to do some build automation, and we're going to use a static site generator. Now you can think of a static site generator effectively as a script that you run in any environment, whether that's locally on your development machine or if it's in a continuous integration server. It effectively turns templates and data and whatever other bits of logic you have into a set of static assets that you can then deploy to a web host. So again, just going back to this, it's the piece that we're on here to generate all of the assets we need so that they're ready for the user when they come along and view the site. There are lots of static site generators around. I mean, a lot of them. They're really popular. There's this site, staticgen.com, which is a good list of those. In fact, what I might do, let's just have a quick look here. So this is staticgen.com, which is an open source repository of lots of static site generators. If I was to start scrolling here, each of one of these is a static site generator. You can see the scroll bar. There's a lot of them. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. It's become very popular to make these things, but a few of them are bubbling up and getting particularly popular, and we'll look at those in a second. But I just wanted to call out that you can explore this site and find the one that's right for you. We've kind of listed here the different languages that they're built in, so you can find something that's been built in a whole host of different languages that you can use. Also the templating language, so the language that you use to express the HTML and express the logic that generates the HTML. There are lots of those as well, and you may already be familiar with some of these, or you can explore these. There are lots of different options there as well. So you can kind of filter these. Let's see. So if I'm used to something which is kind of Django flavored, I can filter it by that. Or EJS is a popular templating language, so there's a bunch that support that. You can explore this to your heart's content. A few that I would call out. So Jekyll was, I think, probably the static generator I encountered first. It's been around for a very long time, was made popular by GitHub, because GitHub Pages supports this as the static site generator that it'll run on your behalf. It's based on Ruby, so you have to install it with a Ruby gem, but you can explore the site and explore the documentation here if you wanted to use that one. I'm going to make a recommendation, which is what we're going to use in our demos in just a minute. But there's Jekyll, there's also Hugo, which is written in Go, which is super fast. Again, we might have considered that one. Gatsby.js is another static site generator which is built on the React ecosystem, so that might be one we consider. But in actual fact, I'm going to make a recommendation in a second. So we can choose the static site generator to suit us based on the language, maybe the workflow that it supports, performance in terms of how quickly it renders the site that it generates. How quickly does that render in the browser? Those different site generators can have different profiles for that. The kind of architecture it supports, how much control we've got over the output. So some static site generators ship with JavaScript frameworks that are quite opinionated on how it'll then do some of the rendering for you if they also have client-side rendering. And different static site generators have different level of adoption and different popularity. All of these are things you might consider when you're choosing a static site generator, particularly for a large project. But for the sake of our examples, I'm going to use a static site generator called Eleventy. You can do this with any of the static site generators you like, but I choose Eleventy for this kind of purpose purely because I find it's got a very logical architecture. It doesn't take a lot of extra knowledge to understand. It does have very flexible templating. It can use a lot of different templating languages, and it happens to support the ones that I think are particularly logical. It doesn't generate in the site anything that you don't ask for. So in other words, it doesn't bundle in a JavaScript framework or any magic. You say, here's my template, please give me the output, and it gives you just that and nothing more, which is good, makes it good for our purposes because it helps us to understand it a little bit better. And also, it's JavaScript all the way down. So in other words, it's built in JavaScript. We install it with JavaScript, so we don't have to do lots of complicated things to get our environment set up. So that's why I like that. So let's jump in and take a look. Okay, so the place we're going to start for that, let's move over back to our terminal. And what I've done is I've actually just copied another folder. We've got a new folder here that we'll work in. Let's just open that up in a code editor so you can see what that is. In fact, it's just a copy of what we had before because we're going to be evolving our previous example. But let's start doing some things now to make it repeatable. So we're actually going to start, we'll install 11t, so we've got a static site generator. We're going to start to build in some automation. It's important that the build steps are something that's repeatable, because that's one of the things that really elevates JAMstack. It's the level of automation and predictability when we repeat tasks, and that goes all the way through to the things like the dependencies. So I'm going to use npm to manage these dependencies. I think if I just create a new npm package just with the default setup here, and now we can start adding dependencies that we'll be able to install repeatably. Now I'm just going to nip over to empty.dev to remind myself of the of what it's called. In fact, I'm just going to copy that, and I'll install that npm I for install, and I will save it. So it's saved this configuration for future use, and that'll go off and install 11t for me. Now, since this is saving it to my package.json, this means that in future, and we'll see this update in a second when it's completed, this means that I'll be able to run a single command and install all the dependencies for the build in future. Right now it's just this one static site generator, but as things evolve, we might start adding a few other libraries, resources, packages here that we'll be able to predictably install in an automated manner each time we want to either redeploy or change this project so it runs somewhere else. Okay, so the installation has completed, and you'll see now we've got a dependency added to our package JSON file in here. So we'll be able to easily reinstall this, communicate what the dependencies are in future. So that's good. But one of the things I want to start changing is perhaps how we've organized things here a little bit. So now you can see by installing 11t, we've got this node modules directory here. We've got the package.json we just created, this package.lock.json file here. There are a few things that are starting to muddy up our source. So I'm actually going to organize things a little bit here. And let's add a source folder, which is where all of our code that we're going to write is going to live, and also, when we run our generator, we're going to output to another folder here as well. But we'll let that be created dynamically. But what I'm going to do for the moment is I'm going to move the index in here. Right, so all of the things that we wrote earlier on, those are going to live in our source directory. Other things, including like a config file for 11t. In fact, I'm going to create that right now. .11t.js. That's the config file that will tell 11t how to build, and we'll start populating that in a second. All of those things are going to live outside the source directory, and then we've got our kind of source directory organized. So what kind of organization are we going to do here? Well, we're going to want to have multiple pages. At the moment we just have one. So a sensible thing to have, if we're going to have multiple pages, is to have a template. So let's let's create that. Now, I happen to know that 11t uses this default of looking in an includes folder for assets it might include. And actually, I'm going to just use our index.html file that we already have. I'm going to move that across into includes, and I'm going to change this into a template. So let's turn that into a nunjux template. That happens to be the language I kind of like using. I'm going to make a little bit more room here. And so this is our HTML file that we were working with in the previous example. How can we make this the basis for a template? Well, there's a few things that we might want to have to be different for every page. So we might want to have a different title for each page. So I'm going to start adding some nunjux syntax here for that. So we'll have a title variable that we'll pass in every time we want to use this. And also the body, let's make that different for every page as well. So I'm just going to copy that, and I'll keep hold of that to use in a second, but we'll pass in a content variable here. I'm going to use a built-in filter from nunjux called safe. So what happens here is whatever content, whatever string we pass through here, and in the first instance it'll be that the HTML that I just cut out of here, whatever we pass through into this variable will pipe through to this filter, and nunjux has one called safe, which means that it can handle the escaping of all of the HTML characters for us. It's safe to just pass that through without escaping. Okay, so let's save that, but we need to add some pages now. So in our source, let's create an index page. We'll call it index.nunjux, and let's paste in our precious HTML that we just took. That'll be the content that we pass through to the template. But the static site generator needs to know a few things. It needs to know some variables that it's going to pass through. So we'll put those in a section at the top here. Now these characters, this denotes a section at the top that we call front matter. And this is in YAML format, which looks like this. Page for you, I think we'll call. I think that's what we had before. And we're also going to tell the 11t what layout to use. We only have one layout at the moment. We call it index. We'll change that. Let's call it base.njk, and we'll change that over here as well. Base.njk. Oops. So now we have this index file that has this content. Let's just play with our formatting a little. And these variables at the top that will pass through to the site generator. Okay, that's looking good. Let's make another page as well. Now let's just copy this, and we'll make an about page about this. Oops, this page for you. Still the same layout, and I'll tell you what. I'll copy something over rather than having you watch me type too much HTML. Okay. So a little bit of information. So now we've got these two pages which are both kind of inheriting and populating this this template when we run our script. Now at the moment we don't have 11t doesn't know where to find these things. So what we can do is we can actually add some configuration here. Again, I'm just going to copy and paste this in, and I'll walk you through what it is. So this is the format for 11t's configuration file, and in essence really all we're doing here is we're setting these values. We're telling 11t which directories to use for the input, and where to put the generated output. So the input is our source directory, here we are, and 11t will create this dist folder. We can add all kinds of other bits and pieces in here, and we'll start populating more things in here, but for the moment that's all we need. So how are we actually going to go about running this 11t command so that we can run our generator? Well, let's have a look first of all at the documentation on the 11t site. Now this was installed globally using this G argument. So that meant that anywhere in the system after you installed it, you'd be able to run the 11t command, run your build, generate your site. Now we didn't install it that way. We installed it slightly differently. We didn't include this global parameter. So that means that it's installed within the context of this build, in the context of this site that we're creating. Now that's not quite as convenient because it means we can't just run the 11t command anywhere we like in any directory, but it is useful because it means that it's now packaged up as a dependency here, so that if any other developer comes along, clones our site, installs the dependencies. They can run that command, and it's kind of sandboxed. It means that it's not a global dependency on their entire environment. That's also useful if we're building the site from a different continuous integration server or build server or something like that, which we're going to get to very, very shortly. So it means we can't just run the 11t command like this, but thankfully npm has a nice solution for that. So what npm does is it allows us to run in this scripts property of the package JSON. It allows us to set up a bunch of different scripts that will run in the context of this environment. So in other words, if we were to run, I'll create something here called build, which we can run with the build command, and I'll replace this. So I'm kind of cannibalizing the test script that was there as boilerplate to start with. Now if I put 11t here like this means that this is going to run the installed package that it has in its node modules for us. So that's fine. That's if we run that there, that should be okay. We've got our configuration for 11t. We've got our template and our files that our pages that it should create. So it should be that now. Did I save everything? Yeah. Okay. So it should be that if I do npm run build, which is the command we just created, that should now run 11t. Here we go. Great. So it's created a dist directory, which is what we're expecting, with an about page and an index page. And you can just about spot here, in fact I'll show it up here, it's organized things in our file structure so that this will kind of create tidy URLs for us. You know, the about page is actually an index file, but it's put in an about folder. So as we serve this from a simple web server, by default you'll get these nice kind of clean URLs, which is nice. Speaking of serving it from a server, that would be a useful thing to do as well. And something a lot of static site generators will do is they'll bundle a very simple server in there for you as well, and you can start using that right away. So let's make use of that as well. So this is a common convention that's kind of cropping up. We'll have a start command in our scripts property here in the package.json. And we'll call 11t again here, but we'll use its kind of inbuilt server. So now when we run this, npm start is a special command in npm, so you don't need to type run. So it's nice and concise. So that's doing the same thing, generated the site for us, but it also then spun up a little server. So now we can go directly to that. So now we're serving this directly, which is nice. I think I should be able to just go to the about page. Great. So we're building a site, we're serving it. There's something wrong here though. We're not seeing our message updating. If I refresh that, we should be getting our client-side JavaScript re-rendering and changing things here. Why might that be? Well, let's go back and look at our code. And we'll look at I'll just collapse that to keep things simple for a second. And what we have here in our code is there's our JavaScript that should be running, and we've got our pages, our files that 11t is going to turn into pages for us. But 11t actually doesn't know about how to use JavaScript by default. It doesn't expect to make a page, a URL for that. It's only looking for the kind of templates that it supports. So it doesn't know what to do with this, and we need to make sure that gets across into our dist folder. In fact, we can see that that's not been moved across there at all. So that's actually a very common thing, and it's a situation we can cater for. So in our 11t config, we can tell 11t that there are certain types of files that we're just going to want to pass straight through. We don't need to make a page for it. We don't need to generate things for it. These are assets that we just want to pass straight through. And so 11t has a little command called pass through copy. And then we can tell that either files or a folder to pass through. So actually what I'm going to do is let's get a bit organized here. And we'll say everything that's in the everything that's in this JavaScript folder will move across. So let's organize ourselves a tiny bit more. New folder, JS, and then we'll pop our JavaScript in there. So any other JavaScript files that we put in here are just going to get moved across to the dist file. So let's save that. Let's run it. Actually, we're going to need to do something else, aren't we? Because now this is going to be moved across to a JS folder. And I think we're just calling it, we need to make sure we've got the paths correct. So let's do that. Now it's regenerated that for us. Let's have a quick look. There we are. That looks a bit. Oh, let's see. Yeah, they are. Our random. There we go. Yes. So we are seeing not very many of our messages popping up, but let's just see. Yeah, our page has been updated. There we are. The JavaScript asset is there and available for us. Something else you might notice if we look at our source here is that, wait, what's this? We didn't write this. Where's this script come from? And I said earlier on when we were selecting which static site generator to use, that I liked 11t because it didn't give us anything we didn't ask for. But hang on, we didn't ask for that. So what's going on here? Well, in actual fact, when we run the serve command, so when we run this guy, that's creating a little web server for us, but it's also making sure that it watches for changes and automatically reloads when we make changes, and that's only happening when we run things through serve. If we run build, this isn't here. This is just a little utility to help us with our development. So let's make a change and let's see that happen right away. Because one of the things we might want to do is in our base template here. Just make a tiny bit more room. Maybe we can add something in here so we've got a bit of navigation to go back and forth. Tell you what, I'll just copy and paste that in. So there we go. We've just got a little header with a link to a home page and an about page. I think if we save that, it should regenerate and reload, and there we are. So that's popped in straight away. So that's why that little utility exists. Now this is kind of nice, a nice attribute of JAMstack sites as well. We've very quickly here bootstrapped a development environment that lets us write the code, see the code as it will be generated, and preview it live with a simple web server. We haven't had to configure a web server of our own. It's all been kind of packaged in with the generator, and that's kind of a nice handy thing to help us kind of bootstrap a development environment very, very quickly. But how do we actually go about deploying this? I mean, so far in previous examples, we've just been handcrafting some files and then just popping those into a hosting environment. But now we've got scripts that run, we've got a build that happens. What we could do is we could run our build script to generate our dist folder, as we've done here, and then take these files, which previously we've made manually, but now we've just automated the creation of them. We could take those and then put those in a hosting environment. That would work just fine. But ideally, what we can really do is we can start to lean on these processes of automation and of version control, so we can actually predictably kind of create these things closer to the environment and make sure that we do things in a repeatable way. One of the great things about modern web development in general, but particularly the JAMstack, is that we can start to use things like version control as a deployment process and start to use some of the facilities that we have for managing our code changes and make those reach right the way through to our deployment process. And we're going to do that now by starting to use Git. I mentioned at the beginning that Git was going to be something we'd need for this example, and we're going to turn this into a Git repository that we'll start managing. Now, before I do that, let's just make things a bit tidy here so we can see what's going on. I'm going to add a git ignore file because at the moment, we're installing gazillions of node modules. There's a lot of things that we're installing here. We don't need to manage all of those in our version control. That's something that can be added by the dependency kind of installation. So let's just exclude that before we do anything else. Just exclude our node modules. We'll also exclude the build assets that come from the dist directory. So neither of these things need to be managed by version control, but it's our source, it's our configuration, description of our dependencies. That's what we want to manage. So with that in place, let's just create a new Git repository here. Lovely, and we can add all of the the assets that we just created, our files that we just created, to be tracked. Initial commit. Okay, so now these are being tracked. And we can actually set up a host to watch this Git repository. But at the moment, this just lives locally. Let's make this a repository that's available somewhere public. Let's do that on GitHub. I tend to use this little utility hub to help me create repositories elsewhere. Let's call this freeCodeCamp 3. This is a bit of a convoluted name, but hopefully this will be easier to keep track of as we're working through examples later on. So just create that repository in my GitHub account. Great. So that's been created now. Here we are. So let's just tidy things up a little bit. Okay, I don't have a README in here, which is bad form. Actually, I haven't pushed this yet. Let's push this. I always forget to push it after using the command. In fact, I'm going to start doing things right from here. So I will push that. It'll probably ask me to publish the master branch. I will indeed. So now we should have this created. There we go. So now we have a Git repository for it. And what we can do is we can have our deployment process watch for changes here and run our build right in the hosting environment. So let's go back to our site that we created before, look at our build settings. At the moment we haven't got this linked to a Git repository. We were just dragging and dropping files in here. But let's link it now to our Git repo. It's just going to ask for permission. I can do a little search. Great, it's found our repository, so we'll link it to that. It's going to look at all the branches. We only have a master branch at the moment, and it's made its best guess of what commands we might want to run. It's noticed that it's an 11t site because it's found that dependency, so it's used the conventions we know about for that. But that's actually not the build command we're running. We were running, if you recall, we were running npm run build to generate the site, and the folder that it created that we want to publish is the dist folder. So we'll add those settings and then we'll hit deploy. And our build should have started. There we go. We can take a look at our build. Now what's happening in this build, in our continuous integration environment that we've now created here, is that the same things that were happening locally, the running of npm install to grab the dependencies and the packages and install those, then to run that npm command. In fact, we can see npm run build has been run, which in turn has run the 11t command. Well, this looks kind of familiar. It's created those folders, created those files, and then finished deploying those. I think we should be able to then go and take a look. Here we are. Yeah. So now we have a live URL which has got both of the pages that we've created, and each time we go to this our home page, our JavaScript is running. So now we've got it's very similar to where we were before, but we're generating this site both in our development environment but also up here in our hosting environment. So we've got deployments happening right here in our hosting environment as well. This is starting to feel like an end-to-end, I sometimes call it a steel thread of having a development environment that reaches right the way through to a production environment where we can be running the same things here locally as we're developing things and building out our code, seeing how things work with a web host, a web server that's kind of running simply here, and then running exactly the same things in a hosting environment or a continuous integration environment, which will run that exact same build and then take that output and publish it to a CDN. So let's just sense check where we've got to. So was that JAMstack? Well, of course, it certainly feels like it was. We're using JavaScript actually now as our build environment. We're not really using any APIs yet. That's coming. We're generating markup. We're serving things directly from the CDN still, so we don't have to manage any web servers. But really, this is the interesting thing, right? So now we're running something at build time, and that's running. It's the same exact thing that's running in our local development environment, as is running in a continuous integration environment and then propagating the output to a CDN. This is starting to feel like an end-to-end development environment, and absolutely this is kind of core to what the JAMstack kind of feels like and how it feels to build sites with the JAMstack. We're going to move on to another example now and start to flesh out more capabilities now that we've got this automation in place. All right, well, on to our next example. So example number 4. Now we're going to start doing some things that finally bring in this API element. So now we're going to be building with data that we get from an API. Once again, the code for this is in the GitHub repository. You can find that at JAMstack X4, this being example number 4. And actually what I've done, this is a new repo. So I've created a new repository and a new site which is linking to that repository. This is exactly the same as in example number 3. It's just that I've created a new repository just so we have clean starting points for each one. If we go and look at the page for that, in fact you'll recognize this. It's just exactly what we had before, with different. Oh, there we are. Random isn't always as random as you'd like. There we are with the different bits of JavaScript rendering at the start. It's exactly the same code, exactly the same deployment that's happened. So we just got a nice clean starting point for that. Now, what we're going to do, let's just refer to our example this diagram that we've been looking at throughout. I'm just going to tidy things up. This is the same thing, just moved over, so we've got a bit more room to operate here. So now, as we run our build, run our generator, either locally in our development environment, which is where we're going to be working next, or indeed once this is happening in our deployment and our continuous integration environment, what we're going to do is we're going to pull in data. Now, the kind of data sources that you might expect to find, there are things like headless content management systems for managing the content of your site. There are pricing engines, e-commerce engines, stock levels, all kinds of different content feeds around the web. You might be pulling tweets or Instagram feeds or all manner of things, news feeds, what have you. And there are a number of ways you can get that visible to our users in the browser. We can either make a request to that API and pull that content in with JavaScript and then render it in the front end. Or we could do what we're going to do now, and we're going to actually pull that content in from the API at build time, include it in the site as we generate our HTML, pop that into the hosting environment, and then it's ready to go when the user comes along to request it. So that's what we're about to do. Steps to do that. First of all, we're going to just iterate on our site generator that we've been using. So we're going to start to use data in the pages and in the templates of the static site generator. Once we've done that and we see how that works, then we'll actually start pulling data in from an API, and I'll show you the API we're going to use in just a moment. And then once we've done that, we also want to make sure that we're not just doing that in our development environment, which of course is where we'll start, but we're also doing that on the live site as it's deployed. So that's what we're about to get up to. So if we pop back over to our terminal, as I mentioned, I've just created a new copy of where we were before in a new folder name. Let's open that up in our text editor. Take a little look at that. Okay, so this should be kind of familiar. We've got our source files, our build assets, the node modules that were installed. It's just the same as where we were before. And now we're going to start adding some content in here. The kind of thing, let's have a little look first of all. So the existing site, this is what that looks like right now. And I think what we'll start doing is we'll add some news items here. So below this kind of little message for me, for my daily message, now there's going to be news items from the day beneath there as well. So what might the code look like for that? Well, we could do that in any number of ways, but let's maybe consider that we might have a list item with news things and a bunch of those. That's the kind of thing that we might want to populate with real content. Now, the way that we can do that with static site generators, this is a very common model in static site generators, that they will have a way of having some kind of folder which will contain data. And 11t is no different to that. It follows the same kind of convention. I'm just going to create a JSON file here called news and put that in a data folder. and then that will become then an object which is available to any one of the templates as we run our build, that will be able to get the data that we put in here and then make use of it. We can manipulate it, iterate over it. So I've just created this little blob of JSON here, which is an object with articles in it, which is an array of these different article objects. At the moment, they've just got a title, just so that we can see this working and start to bring this to life. Let's change our markup here to actually start using that. Of course, we only need one of these. We're going to iterate over this. We'll access this news object and then iterate over the things that we find in there. So let's do that with some nunchucks. So for article in news is our data object, and it was the articles object within that. That's going to be our loop. In fact, we don't want those tags inside there. It's just the list items we're going to be creating. And then let's output some property of article. I think we've got the title for each of those. So let's just double check. Yeah, articles, title, news articles, article title. Okay. And we've used the default location in 11t to find the data, but I forget if it picks that up automatically. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to be very explicit and say to 11t that this is the location to find that data. So now it'll certainly know where to look. And I think if we run our npm start, I think what we should get, let's make sure we've got enough room to see. Okay, it looks hopeful. If we look in our dist, we should probably be able to see what's been. Okay, that looks hopeful. So let's look at it in our browser. Okay, formatting may be a little bit funky, but we're starting to iterate over data that we've got in a data file. So that's all fine and dandy, but we really want to make sure that we're getting data from a real data source. At the moment, this is just whatever data structures we want to have here. So we're actually going to start to use a remote data source, something that exists out on the web. Now, let's just tidy up. Okay, so the source we're going to use is this. It's News API. As I mentioned, we could be using any number of things, but News API is going to serve us quite well for our kind of our examples. This gives a free service, so you can get news data. It's a paid service if you're going to be doing this more seriously, but for our purposes, we can make 500 requests a day. We can get various bits of news data. That's going to work well for us. Now, in order to be able to use this, you are going to need an API key. It's very, very simple to do. If you go to newsapi.org, hit get API key, it'll give you a chance to create a little account. I set mine up already, but it'll give you something like this where it has your details, and you can then easily get this API key that we'll be able to use in our requests to their API. I'm not too shy about sharing this with you. I can always regenerate that later on, but this typically is a secret. When it's the kind of thing that's going to give access to a privileged or a paid service, this is something you're going to want to keep secret. We'll talk in a little bit about how we keep that secret, but for the time being, we want to start pulling some of this data in. News API is great. It's got lots of documentation on the different endpoints, what kind of data you can get. I'm probably going to use headlines. I think it could potentially be a bit bleak depending on what the news is at the time, but it's a nice API that we can call in to bring in some structured data that perhaps fits with the kind of model that we're starting to build out in our HTML. Now, what I like to do is to start exploring the APIs, not in my JavaScript, but just right in the terminal. I mean, the thing that we've got here is a nice URL that we can query. We can make a GET request on that and start to see the data that comes back. It's documented here. We can start to see the shape of the data that we should expect to get back. And in fact, if we just look a bit further into the News API site, we can see the kind of parameters we can pass in our URL to get different data, whether it's filtering it by country or particular category, other bits and pieces, page size, how many results we might want to get back. This is great because we can start exploring the API and see what we want to use. So in fact, I'm going to just copy that. I noticed that since I'm logged in, they've automatically populated my API key, which is handy. I don't have to do any management of that. But I can start. Where are we? There we are. I can start exploring that. So I'll tell you what. Let's do that right here. You know, I can just in my terminal, I can do a curl. Oops. Tell you what. Let me make sure I haven't got any space. There we go. Too many spaces. If I just curl that, I'm starting to get data straight away. In fact, what I'll do is I'll pipe that to a little utility I've got called JQ, which will format that by because since it's JSON data, so we can see that a little bit more easily. So that's nice. We're starting to see we've got this array of articles that have source, author, title, some content, a date on there. This looks like something that we can use in our results to replace this JSON that I've currently got manually added there. So let's start doing that. Let's start using this API as a source to replace this data. I'm not going to use curl directly in here. I want to use some JavaScript for this. So I'm going to use a library called Axios, which can actually run client side, so in the browser, or server side, so in our development environment or on whichever hosting environment, to make requests and get data for us. It's nicely documented. There's some examples of how to use that. But before I do anything, I'm going to need to include this. Now, if you recall, in our package.json, we have our dependencies. And at the moment, we're just depending on having 11t installed, but we're going to add something else to that now. So I'm going to do an npm install and save Axios, and that will go off and install the dependencies for that, and it'll add that into our little dependencies file. Excellent. We're not going to need that now for the time being. And now I'm going to actually start using that here. I'm going to replace. This isn't JSON anymore. This is actually going to be JavaScript. We can lose all of that because we're going to be returning that data rather than just specifying it. Let's have another little look to see how we use Axios. There's some examples of how to install it, like we just did. Some examples of we need to require that, so we'll do that in just a second. And we want to use this asynchronous function because we're making a request to another service, and we want to wait for that response to come back before we yield it back to our static site generator. I'm just going to steal that function wholesale, and let's start adding this in. Oops. Now we do need to require the Axios library that we've installed, so we'll do that just with a require method. Great. Now we've got that available to use down here. This URL isn't quite right. Let's first of all, I think we're done with that for now. Let's use the same URL that we were experimenting with in our curl statement. Oh, that does need to be a string. Okay, so there's that. Now I happen to know that this is going to return a response object, and we want the data from that response object. So we're going to do return response data, and this is in a try catch. So if there's an error making this request, it will return this error. Okay, I think that's going to give some data. Let's see what happens when we run that. So running our npm start again. Oh, now what's our problem that we've got here? There we are. Have a little typo. You're probably screaming at the screen as I type that. Okay, that looks a bit better. So now we can see it's telling us our build is telling us how long it took to return that data. Let's have a look at the page and see if we're not seeing any data. So let's see what we might be doing wrong here. Oh, okay. Well, we're not quite done because we've created this function, but we're not actually yielding anything from this. So we need to make sure that this yields some data back to 11t. So we're going to make this. It's a little asynchronous function, but actually it's an anonymous function, which is fine. Let's see. Yeah, that looks That looks good to me. Let's give that another try. In fact, it's seen my change. It's picked up the change and it's rerun it. Let's see. Oh, there we go. So now we're yielding a bunch of data, and we're kind of fortunate that the shape of the data that we were expressing in our template to start off with. I glanced ahead, so I happened to know that we were going to be having a title object come back. So we're iterating over all of the data that comes back, and at the moment we're just blatting the title onto the screen. So there's a bunch of data. Let's start tinkering with this now. First of all, let's change the page size. I don't think we're going to want all that much. So I noticed there was a page size parameter. Let's just say 5 of those. Okay, so we're only getting 5 of those things back, and perhaps we could improve our template a little. At the moment, we're just outputting the title. Let's make this a little bit nicer. Let's perhaps format that with an H2, and let's make this a link to the actual document, the actual article rather. I'm going to refresh my memory. What was the format here? Okay, so we've got title, yes, URL. Okay, great. So article.url. What else might we want to close that tag? Oops. What other items might we want on here? I'll tell you what. Let's perhaps put the name of the source, perhaps, and a date. I think it's good to have a date on here. So we've got the source name. So we'll call that. So we'll get to that with article.source. Dot name, and let's also put, I think, maybe a time as well. Cool. Dot what was it? Published at time. Published at. Is that looking about right? I think so. We stopped our build running, so let's get that running again. Okay, that's run successfully. All right. Okay, so now we're getting the text of the news article from our news feed. We're getting the URL for that. Let's see if we take that through. This should take us through to Android Police, which is the source of this news article. I'll try not to get too engrossed in actually reading the article. Let's go back. The date, we're not formatting that date at the moment, but we can certainly start doing that. All right, this is starting to look like we've got some data in a useful way. This page, my kind of daily page for me, is starting to come together a little bit. We're baking this HTML out at build time. I'm sure we can make some improvements here though to this news feed. There's a few things hard coded that we perhaps don't want. We've got our API key in here now. This is safe because it's server side. We're not exposing this in the client in the front end. This is all happening at build time. But we're committing this code to our version control now, so we don't really want this API key to be checked into our version control, because that's going to leak that out into the world. So I'm going to abstract that out, I think. Oops, if I can select it. There we go. Let's yoink that out, and instead, if I turn this into a template string instead. We can do some string manipulation in here and make this a little bit friendlier. So let's instead populate that with an API key variable that we can place in here. Now, where are we going to get that? We could be populating that manually, but certainly we want to be able to use this in our local development environment, but also we want to be able to have this run in our build environment. Remember, we're checking this in and letting the build do this for us in the hosting environment. So we're going to use an environment variable for this. So the way we can access that is through process.env. So this will have access to any environment variables, in this case the one called API key, at the time that the process runs. Now we haven't declared that anywhere locally, so this isn't going to work for us. What we need to do is to use some kind of tool to populate this for us locally as if it was an environment variable, and we can do that using a nice little tool called .env, which has the purpose of doing exactly what I just described. So we're going to install this as a dependency as well, and start to use the structure that it tells us about here. So first things first, let's get this installed as a dependency. We'll just quit out of that again. npm install save .env. That'll go off and install that, save that into our dependencies as before. Let's have a quick refresher of how we used that. So if we just require this at the top of our JavaScript file, and as long as we've got a .env file in our code, it'll pick things up from there instead. So tell you what, before I lose the environment variable that I pasted into my clipboard, there it is, preciously held there. Let's assign that to a variable. Great, and save that in our .env file. Now this is our secret. We don't let that string. This is our secret. We don't want to commit this to our version control, so I'm just going to put this also into our git ignore file, so this will not get committed. It's quite nice also just to have, so that other people, when they're coming to use this code, they know this is what they need to populate with their own API key. So I actually just duplicate that and call that sample .env, and then we can, there we go. So that can get checked in, so people will know to create this env file. We'll document that, of course, so that people will know to populate this with their own key. And then when we run this, where are we? When we run our news script, we'll be able to get access to that data. Now, how does it tell us to do that? Here we are with this. So we require that and run the config method, and that should populate this in a way that we can. It keeps our API key secret. So let's give that a try, shall we, and see how it's doing. Okay, looks good. Okay, great, we're in good shape again. So that's fine for running our build and our environment locally, but we need to make sure that this environment variable is available when we run this in our build. So tell you what I'll do. I'm actually going to let's commit all of our changes, adding dynamic data. And we'll push our changes. Now, as you recall from our previous example, our deployment process is now linked to Git. So when we push our code, we should see our deployment start to kick off and another deployment to happen. So let's just see if that's the case. Let's refresh this. Okay, so we have another build running here. Now this is going to fail because we haven't currently shared that environment variable. That only lives on our local machine. But let's just let the build go through. It'll install any new dependencies because we've of course added a few dependencies in there. But things are certainly going to fail for us. Yeah, here we are. We're having our build fail. But what we really need to do is we need to make sure that let's go back to our code. This environment variable, which we just called API key, maybe we can make that a bit more descriptive. I'll do that in a second. And let's do it now. Let's call it news API key, just in case we end up with other APIs that we want to use. So change that there. Just change it in our sample so the reference is correct as well. And of course we want to change it in our code. So this is the, there we go. Okay, this is an error from when we were changing it. We're still watching, but let's just make sure. Are we happy in our local build? If I refresh that, no, we're not. To restart this. I haven't saved my file. There we are. Just restart this again, just to make sure everything's happy. Okay, we're back in good order. I'm going to push this code change again, just because we've changed our environment variable. Now this is still going to fail. Descriptive envar. We'll push this again, so another deployment is happening. But what we'll go and do is we're going to add this this API key also to our environment up here. Okay, so there's a build queued up, ready to go. That'll start in a second. If we go to deploy settings, I think we should be able to find environment. Okay, great. We can start to add environment variables. So what do we call that? We call it news API key, and let's grab the value for that as well. Okay, so now we have a situation where our secret is stashed away in our hosting environment and our continuous integration environment for where the build runs, but we also have it locally in our development environment, but it's not checked into our version control, so it's still a secret for us. Okay, let's see if we can see that running. Okay, so that's it looks like that. Oh no. Okay, so so we weren't able to get the data, but the build did still complete. So I'm actually going to kick off another build. Let's trigger another deployment manually. So now our environment variable should be there. The code should be there, ready to scoop up the environment variable and use it, and then we should be publishing that to the build. All right, that seems to have completed. Let's have a little look. Okay, great. So now here's our published version of the site. We're getting the same data. If I reload this a few times, our message should change. There we are. That's changing. So our client-side JavaScript's running. Our data source that was gathered at build time has been there and populated. Our links off to the various places work. Back we come. So we have our next set of the build running. Okay, let's at this point take a little review, take stock of what we've got to here, because yeah, we started to use data in our static site generator. We're requesting that from an API, and we're using that in both our development and in our deployments. So this situation here, this is where we are now. Now, if you remember our API, this service here, our news API, I think just our development version access, our free access, I think they had a limit of something like 500 requests a day. Were we to be recording this in with JavaScript in the browser, the number of requests we'd be making would be coupled to the number of visitors we have, how much traffic we're getting to our site. You know, if we have 1 million users, we're going to have 1 million requests on our data source. That's a problem. The way we're doing it at the moment is we're only calling that data at build time. So we've got a very light load on our data source. Now this is a nice attribute of pre-generating as much as you possibly can, and that's something I really advocate for when using the JAMstack. Pre-generate as much as you can so that you can render it ahead of time and get it ready to request, not just so that it's, you know, we don't have to do any work for the user here because it's done in advance, but also because it means it lightens this load on the data source. You could say, well, that means that this page is very static because we're not deploying changes very often, or we're not getting changes very often from our data source. But with 500 requests a day to this, frankly, we could be making this request and redeploying every 5 minutes and updating that so that it's ready to go. That would feel far from static. That would feel pretty dynamic if this news that we found here was only 5 minutes old. Likewise, this probably doesn't change every 5 minutes. We could be doing things like triggering this build to happen when the data is changed, so that we only build when there's an update to show. And that means that every time a user comes to this page, they'll be getting the data that was updated most frequently, but we won't need to be building all the time. And there are techniques for that as well. So I think that's it for this particular example. We're still using a little bit of JavaScript client-side to do that client-side rendering of that little personalized message, but we're also using JavaScript build time to get that query, get that data from an API to get those news items, pre-generate those into markup that we can then deploy to the hosting environment, deploy them directly to the CDN. We'll expand on that in the next example. We'll start doing more requests to API and start to do more things with that data, still generating that markup. But that's it for this example. We'll move on to the next thing now. I think next it's a good time to start talking about this. Let's talk about personalization. I think that this is often an area where people think that you can't start tackling this challenge with a JAMstack site, with a pre-generated site that's served as a bunch of static assets. And thankfully, that's not quite the case, and we'll get into how this works. Traditionally, so this is again looking at our diagram of a traditional stack. Where we have maybe a web server and a database running, where these things are handling the requests in real time, in at request time. The job that's being done here in the traditional stack is the web server has got its templates and whatever other logic is making its request to get data, and it's applying that data to the templates with whatever other logic to generate a view and then return that back to the user. In fact, this operation of turning templates and data into a view, well, that's kind of what we have with static site generators. I think of static site generators as a tool which apply structured data to templates in order to create views and assets. It's just a little bit different that rather than doing it at request time, instead we do it here at build time. We do it up front. It's kind of doing the same job, but it's just that we're preloading that effort. And I think that given that this is happening ahead of time and we're doing this before we know who the user is that's coming to request the data, I think that's why a lot of people think that you can't do anything other than one size fits all content. And luckily that's not quite true. It's worth us just looking for a second about at a view at what personalization is. I think of personalization and universal content as a bit of a spectrum. It's at one end we have content which is evergreen and good for anybody. No matter who they are, they all get the same content. At the other end of the spectrum, we have content which is being served up specifically to an individual. You've maybe authenticated, we've noticed who you are, so we can serve something specific to you. But in fact, there's a lot of things that are in between here, and a lot of sites actually lean further down this end of the spectrum than you might expect. So I think of this spectrum as also containing localized content. So that's content which maybe has been populated specifically for people who are coming to the site from a particular part of the world. We sometimes think of internationalized content as well, where it's being translated into different languages. But localization is ever so slightly different. This is targeting the content based on where the visitors are coming from. Now, we don't need to know the exact individual that's coming to that. We just need to know where in the world they're visiting from and what information might be useful to them. But it's certainly not quite the same as universal content. And then the next step in the spectrum is what I think of as targeted content. So depending on who the person is, but not necessarily down to the very specifics of who that person is. So what kind of user are they? Are they an admin? Have they got rights to a particular section of the site? Can we then target content that's tailored for their group of people, if you like? So we might think about roles and targeting content that way. Again, it doesn't need to be a one-to-one relationship between the type of content there is and the individual. This might be kind of batches and groups. It's only when you get right to this very end of the spectrum where the content is very specific to an individual. With JAMstack, we can actually address every area of this spectrum. It's just a question of how much we do in the browser, client side, with JavaScript. I mentioned at the very beginning of this video about the stack moving up a layer, moving closer to the individual, closer to the browser, and that's what JavaScript gives us because it's a runtime that runs right there in the user's browser. So using that and some techniques, we can get to the point that we're delivering very personalized, specific information to a user. But there's a whole road to travel before we necessarily need to do that. And the next example, what I want to do is I want to talk about creating some localized content as well. So There is some enablers that have allowed us to do that, and I talked at the very beginning again about enablers. And just to recap, some of the enablers that help us with this are automation. We've already started introducing automation. We've got builds that run on command. They're scripted, they're repeatable, they're predictable, and we can automate their builds. A number of tools and services are starting to emerge. We've already been using services for news APIs. We're hosting on a service that gives us continuous integration and those kind of things. And there's been a huge explosion in the API economy. So all of these different resources are available over APIs that we can now leverage. One of the key things for things like localization and personalization are the kind of services that we have now at the edge, at the CDN, the network that's delivering the content. If we go back to this diagram once again, I've been talking so far about building things ahead of time and then deploying them directly to a CDN. The fact that all of our assets are there and they're ready to go when the user comes along means that with a tiny bit of intelligence at the CDN layer, we can start to do intelligent things with that information, with that data. We can route different people to different assets that are on there, and we'll come to that in a minute. But I don't want to be accused of oversimplifying this versus the traditional stack. I haven't included a CDN here anywhere. So you might be thinking, well, this is all fine. If we're hearing about the power that you can do with things that are CDN, we not just have that here as well? And of course, that's absolutely fair. In a traditional stack, often there is a CDN included as well. The challenge there is that in a traditional stack, when you've got a CDN as well, let me expand this diagram. I didn't really want to include this in my initial diagram because it looks so complex. But since we're not serving everything just purely from a CDN, but we're also serving some things from the web server, which are getting data from the database, compiling things, either returning them directly, maybe pushing some things to a CDN to be cached. Maybe some things are pushed directly to the CDN from build time. The visitor, the user, is making some requests to a CDN, some requests to a web server. There's complexity here, so adding a little bit of logic there impacts a whole load of the stack. Whereas with the JAMstack approach, everything is the CDN. There's no other logic to worry about for other bits and pieces behind the scenes here. We've pushed all of our resources to the CDN. So then if we do apply some simple logic here to route different people to different assets that are there, we don't have to worry about some of these things missing and having to pass through to other bits of infrastructure. So our next example, what we're going to do is we are going to start generating some localized content, and we'll start building that out. Now, the things that we're going to do along the way, we're going to generate different views for many locales. So we're building on the example that we had before. And then what we'll start to do is we'll start to route the traffic at the CDN level to the different views, the different resources that we've generated and populated at the CDN. Then, as an extension to that, what we'll start doing is we'll start automatically generating our CDN config as well. So those are the things we're going to do. I skipped over this, but let's just remind ourselves the code for this. It's just a copy of our starting point is a copy of where we got to in example 4, but this is example 5. So you can go directly to the repo and poke around with the code if you like. Find that at JAMstack X5. Okay, so with that said, let's get stuck in. So I have created a new site for this. It's exactly the same as we've been looking at before, but since it's a new Git repository, I've made a new site for it. Let's have a quick look. It looks, we're familiar with this now. We've got our news stories in there, behaving the way we were kind of expecting. But let's start making some changes to the code. So where to begin? Well, at the moment we're making this request for our news data from this API, but we do have this facility to specify the country that we want to get the news for. So let's just go and take a quick look at the docs for this. Here we are. This is the news API.org site again, and this is in fact the feed we're using. There's our country code, and it supports. Let's look down here. Here we are. So the country parameter supports all of these. So we could generate a page of content for every one of these countries and then route people to it. I'm just going to start with a handful of them. Whoops, a handful of them to begin with, because each of these requests is going to be another request to the API, and I'm still on the free account here in this little demo, so I've only got 500 requests a day, and the likelihood is that I might want to make lots of changes to this, so I just don't want to be hammering the API. So let's just be a little bit efficient about that. But perhaps we could create ourselves a little set of countries. Okay, so if we make ourselves this little array, okay, that'll do us, I think. So we can expand on this later on and put all of these in here. But just for the sake of not hammering the API while we're just developing it, we'll just use these. If we look at our existing function at the moment, well, we're just doing this one request. So perhaps if we take this out, put this as its own function, then we can call that for each one of our feeds. So let's see. You know what? We're just going to take this whole thing. So this async function, it's no longer anonymous, so let's call it get news, and we'll pass in the country, and then we'll use that country here. So oops, there we go. Now at the moment it's just returning articles, but we're going to want to maybe change the structure of the data that comes back here so that we can use it more conveniently in our templates. So let's return a little object here, and perhaps we'll have a couple of keys in here. So maybe we have country and then the country that we passed in, and then the data itself. Let's stick with referring to those as articles. Then we'll go directly into the articles to get that. How does that look? That looks good, pretty good to me. I don't need that. Okay, and then we will call that for every one of our members of our array. So let's do that. This is going to return a promise of this data in this structure. So let's just collect these together in a promises array. Let's select news promises, and we'll iterate over our list of countries, which we have to just grab in a second. So let's use a map for this and call get news. Great. To make sure we have access to that, let's require our list of countries. Okay. Great, we should now have access to those. And then once we've returned all of our data and got our promises, let's get all of the. So this is going to give us an array of these objects. So let's munge all of those together. So we'll need to do that once the promises have all returned. So let's use promise.all for that, and that's the use promises. So when those have all returned, then what we can do is we'll take the news objects that we've got back, so each one of those items, and what I think we'll do is we'll just concatenate all of those together into one array. Tell you what, let's actually just we'll take a look at those as we're going as well. So we can just see, just inspect those a little bit. What we're going to return from here is all of those. Let's have an array with all of those other arrays munged together. So let's use this little trick. objects. Like that. Looks good. I will need to prompt return this to 11t as well. Let's see. How's that looking? Looks pretty good. Let's start to think about. So let's see if this this does give us some data back. Now our data is going to come back in a slightly different shape. So I think a sensible thing to do is to change our template to make sure. So now we've got an array of all of these items. So let's just look at the first one in the array first of all. Why is this? This is telling me problem. I think we're probably not. Let's close. Let's just complete this. There we are. It's slightly better shape. Okay, let's give this a little run. See if we are still getting data. Okay, so we have a problem. Can't find countries.json. Countries.json. Oh, there we are. Give that another whirl. Okay, that's looking hopeful. So we console out the shape of our data. So we do have our news object, which is being passed back to 11t for our static site generator. And that's looking how we'd like it. So we're getting a country member with the country code in there, and then an array of our objects. So that's looking hopeful. Let's now see if we're actually saying, okay, great. So we are looking at the first item in our data set. This is in Arabic. So good. We're getting data the way we want. Now, what's next? Well, we're going to want to make a page for each one of those. At the moment, all we have is this index page. But really, for each one of these items, we're going to want to make a page for that. Now, static site generator is very, very good at doing this kind of thing as well, creating different files for different sets of data. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate our index page. Let's call this localized. Because we're going to want this to look actually the same. We're not going to go just for the first item in the array. But we're going to use a little trick which 11t has based on pagination. Now, a common pattern when you're working with structured data is, maybe you've got a set of blog posts or a set of pages. You want to have a listing page that you iterate over that. You don't want to have every single one of those entries visible on one page. Maybe you'll paginate that so that you can have sets of 20 and page through the kind of an index page for that. And 11t has a nice model for that. And you can actually use that to generate just a single pages as well, rather than listing pages. So I'm going to cheat by putting in some different front matter, very similar to what we had before. So I've just changed the title now to Daily Briefing, because this is starting to become a page that's got a different purpose. It's our set of news stories to start the day. And what we've got here is we're starting to use this property of 11t, this pagination feature. It's going to say, where are we going to get the data for this pagination? Well, we've got our news collection, our news set of data, which we're generating over here. Now, the page size, if we were to want to create a listing, maybe we would have 10 of those, and in the code underneath, we'd maybe iterate out over those, create a listing of these pages. But we're just going to have a page size of 1, so it's going to make a set of individual pages. We'll have this little alias here, so we can address it more easily. And now we've got the chance to specify what the address of this page is. So from our news data object, we'll access the country. So in other words, this little chap down here, we'll create that and an index file for that. So this page will live at that address. And then for each of the pages, well, this is just the same code that we had before for our index page. And I don't think, since we structured it the same way, I don't think we're going to need to change anything. That should work just as is. Let's give it a shot and see if that's going to generate a bunch of different pages for us. Well, yeah, indeed it did. So we've got now all of these different pages created. Let's go and take a little look. We should be able to access. Do you know what? I need to just refresh my memory. What languages did we have? AE, Australian as well. Let's have a little go for that one. So there's our Australian news. great. We've got news pages for different regions now. Tell you what, let's make this page a bit of a listing of these so that we can more easily navigate our way around it. Let's change that on the about page. So here, since we have access to this news object, we can start now to make use of that. So let's just loop over that with for, I don't know, item in news. Just close that loop before I forget. Oops. And for and then let's simply put a link to the page for each one. Item.country. Let's just pop the same thing here as well. Item.country. Alright, so now if we run this again, in fact, I think it's been watching us. Yes, great. So here we are. We've got pages for each of these locales. So well, why don't we? This is looking good to me. Why don't we now let's create one for all of these pages. That's the nice thing about structured data. We could get this set again, get the entire lot, and we'll put it into our countries. Here we are again. See if I can get the multi-caret formatting. There we go. Oh, how gratifying. Okay. Oh, I missed one. There we are. Okay. So let's see. I'm just going to restart that. Make sure it picks up the data. Whoa, bosh! Load of pages made. Yeah, lots of pages created. If we go to our page, let's reload that. Yeah, so we've got one for all of these now. So the Belgium page, great. Different similar themes coming up in all the news stories today. But yeah, there we have it. So we've got a bunch of different pages. Now we're not directing people to these specifically, but there are addresses that people could get to. So what's the next thing? How are we going to actually start to direct people at the CDN level directly to the right page for them? Luckily, I was talking about enablers and the fact that CDNs now can have different logic that you can execute. Netlify is no different to that. I'm using Netlify as our example, and what we can do is we can use the redirects support. Let's say country. Yeah, here we are. Let's just look at the docs for this. Redirect by country or language. So this is becoming more popular as something that you can access at the CDN. Now, CDNs have traditionally been very, very complicated and difficult to use, or very much, I'd say, a pro level thing to be working on, and it's often problematic for people to configure these really efficiently. The barrier to entry is coming down all the time for this, and configuring the logic at the CDN level for Netlify is as simple as having a redirects file and then putting this kind of declarative config in here. So the way that this works, for instance, this logic is saying for any visit coming in at the root level, we're going to direct it to this path instead. It's going to use a 302, so it'll do a redirect. But this is only true if the country is Australia or New Zealand. So we can start serving localized content. This is actually exactly what we want. So why don't we make one of those ourselves? So let's go back to our code. So let's create a redirects file. But rather than typing that for each one of these, let's generate it automatically. We already have this object. We're using a static site generator that changes data into views. Let's make one also for creating our redirects. So let's say it's a redirects.njk, and what we'll do is we'll say we'll ask it to create the file in the right place using this permalink. Oops, permalink property. And then we'll say, okay, which is going to be underscore redirects. So that's the name of the file we want to create. So the pattern then is any traffic that comes into the root of the site, we're going to want to redirect that to a country. So let's say that's GB, for instance, index.html. That's where the content is served. And we're going to want to do that with, we could do that with any response code that we want. In the examples there, it was using a redirect. I'm actually going to use a rewrite instead, so I'll just do it with a 200. So the URL for the user will just stay exactly the same, but behind the scenes I'll be serving the content from that resource. But we'll only do that if the country equals GB. So that's the form that we want, but we want that for every item. So let's for every country. So let's do that programmatically, because we've got this access to all of the items in news. No, in news. That's our news object. Just close that loop. So what we want to do is rather than have GB, we're going to access the item.country. So we should be able to then generate this format of redirects file with all of our entries created for us programmatically at build time. So let's give that a whirl. Okay. Looks like that's done its thing. Let's check this out. Yeah, there we go. So we have an entry for each of these things. We could actually clean up the white space a tiny bit. In fact, there's a couple of other things I might just add here. So we'll do this just to clean up the white space so we don't get those empty rows in between. But there's another couple of things I'm going to do here. Since we're going to create a page for every country, one of these should probably be the default rather than having an index page. So I'm actually going to I'll delete the index page now, so we're not going to need that. We're going to serve every one of our views from one of our localized generated pages. It's just fewer things to generate. And what we'll do is we'll set a default here, or like a fallback. I'm just going to pop over back to the docs for a second, because what we can have is we can also use this format for serving custom 404 pages. Now, strictly speaking, we should probably create a different 404 page for every language, localized into the language or into the locale, translated perhaps into the correct language. For our purposes, though, I'm just going to use this as our way of generating a fallback, or rather routing people to a fallback page. So when the way the rules are applied is it starts at the top, and as soon as it finds a match, it serves that entry. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the English, the British page be the fallback. So if for any reason none of these conditions are met, we'll just serve people this page instead. That means I can get rid of that index.html file and we'll serve that page instead. There we go, we've generated that as well. One other thing I think we might do here is, because it's going to be difficult for me to demonstrate this to you. In a second, we'll deploy this into our hosting environment, and then you kind of just have to take my word for it that if people are viewing it from different places, they'll get routed there, because I'm only accessing the site from one location. But just for the sake of demonstration, if we look back at the docs here, go to our country and language. So yeah, these are the conditions. If the locale of the visitor is detected to be one of these regions, we'll route people there. But we can also do the same for language settings, and I can control that a little bit more easily to demonstrate that. So based on that, what I'll do is I'll just create one for the sake of just demonstrating this, but let's route people to the French site with 200. So again, we're rewriting rather than redirecting, and rather than country, we'll use language equals FR. So this will look at the accepts language header in their browsers, in the viewers' browsers, and if it's set to French, we'll serve the source from there. If that's not the case, it will look for the location, see if it's the correct country and route them to the right place. If it can't find any of these things, we'll serve the English page. So I'm going to generate that one more time. Oh, I wonder if I've hit my... Oh no, we're fine. Okay, we're good. Let's have a little look at the redirects page. Okay, so our white space has been cleaned up. We've got our language option at the top. Got our 404 at the bottom. This is looking good to me. So what I'm going to do, let's commit these changes. Rewrites. We'll commit those changes. We'll deploy them. So we'll push them to our repository, which in turn does a deployment. Let's go and watch that happening. But I go to our deploys. It's just a little reload. Okay, so we've got something building. Now we should see at the point that this has all been generated, we should see that as the deployment has happened, Netlify will notice the redirects file. It will. Oh, I should really have removed my logging. It will notice the redirects file, set up the configuration at the CDN level. We should get some kind of confirmation that it's noticed those. Yes, 56 redirects rules have been processed. We've uploaded all of these new files that we've generated for all of our various versions. Let's go and take a look at this. So this should, even though I don't have an index page yet, we've been taken through to the English version of this. We should have, yeah, here's our listing for all of the different versions. But if I change, I've got a little extension here just to make it easy to change my language settings for the browser. Oh, it happened faster than I could refresh. It actually does that for me. So now the same URL is being rewritten to the French version of the site. So we've got the French content. It's exactly the same as if I'd chosen to go directly to here. No, thank you. I don't want to translate. If I change I'll go back to the home page. If I change my language back to English, in fact, I think if it would happen for any other language, I'd just default back to the English version. Great, that seems to be working nicely. So let's have a little recap of what we've just done. So now at our static site generator, we've generated views for many locales, and we've done that by querying for different content for the different locales. Our API that we're requesting from supports that, but we've used our static site generator to generate the views for all of those locales right away. Then we set up our configuration to route the traffic at the CDN level to whichever of the assets that we pre-generated that's appropriate to the users that are visiting the site. And the generation of that config has happened as part of the static site generation as well. So it kind of streamlines that whole process for us once we understand just how that config works. This feels to me like we're moving from like universal pages across to localized pages, and you could argue with the addition of that language header as well, that language detection, starting to target particular users as well. So users who have identified themselves as wanting content in a particular language, we're starting targeting people. Targeting content specific to those. We haven't got into personalized content yet. For the following example, we're going to get more into this realm a little bit. But just as our little sense check once again, was that JAMstack? Because we're doing quite a lot of things there. Well, yeah, I'd say it certainly is. You know, we're using still a tiny bit of JavaScript in the front end, but really the JavaScript at the moment is being used to generate the site, make the request to that API, also generate the configuration and build up the markup that we serve. We're pre-rendering all of these files. We're serving everything directly from a CDN. And even though we have that tiny bit of logic that it lives at the CDN, we still don't have a web server to manage. We've got no infrastructure that we're managing at the moment. Everything is pre-rendered and served directly from the edge from a CDN. So yeah, I think we're still very much in JAMstack territory. Okay, so I think that wraps it up for this example. We'll move on to something a little bit further on, building on this next. What I wanted to do next was start to introduce a little bit more in the client side. We're already doing a tiny bit of client side rendering. We're only updating one tiny string from a random set of messages just to prove the point. The most of what we're doing at the moment is server side rendering at build time. We're generating all of those content pages from a content API, building those out, and then there is a tiny bit of client-side rendering happening just as a little embellishment. But we're going to do a little bit more now here. We're going to actually start bringing different kinds of data that maybe would be a bit more personal to the user, or a bit more targeted for the particular user rather than just being at a country level. So just as a little recap, this is our situation at the moment. We're pulling our content from this data source at build time, generating our build, propagating that to the hosting environment. So when the browser comes along, it can request those pages and everything's ready to go. The slight change now is that we'll add a little bit more JavaScript. So in the browser client side, we'll be able to use JavaScript to interrogate APIs not just in the browser, but also from another data source. So we'll have multiple data sources in play now. So yeah, we'll introduce a bit more client-side rendering. We'll make those client-side API calls. We'll interact with browser APIs, and also, towards the end of this example, we'll start to introduce serverless APIs as well. So we're going to be building our own API layer, but we'll do that with serverless functions. This work that we're going to be doing in the browser, we're going to use progressive enhancement for this. Now, I want to just talk about progressive enhancement just for a second, because this is something that sometimes gets a little bit overlooked. Progressive enhancement is intended as a safe and performant way to add interactions to websites so that you don't have to have an all or nothing situation. And the way I like to think of it is this. I like to think of it as deciding what is critical to the experience. So in our example, we might decide that the news is critical. It's a news page, so we want to have the news there without any dependencies. So this is all pre-rendered. So when the browser comes along, there's very little work to do. We'll get that HTML and we're able to just display it. So we'll deliver as much of this as possible using as little as possible. So there are very few dependencies for the user's browser and their device in getting that critical experience that we've decided on. Then after that, we detect what supported features there are in the browser and enhance the experience where possible. So in the example that we're about to work on, the kind of things that we'll detect in terms of supported features are the ability to get the user's location from the browser APIs, and then on the basis of having that, enhancing the experience to add, in our case, we'll add some weather information for the user's location. So we'll be doing this all with this progressive enhancement approach. So doing as much as possible early and then just enhancing for the less critical pieces as an enhancement where those are available. Okay, so let's get into the example. This is example number 6 for client-side API calls. Once again, the code that we're going to be building out, that's going to be at a GitHub repository, which you can get to find that at JAMstack X6 for exercise 6. There are a few other links and resources in this example as well, and those will be all on the GitHub repository. So let's take a little look. Before we dive into the code, I want to actually just introduce you to the services we're going to use. I'll catch you up a tiny bit. While you blinked between the last demo and this demo, I've done the same thing again. I've copied the previous example into a new repository, and I've set up a new site which is pointing to that repo, but it's exactly as, in fact, let's just open it up. It's exactly as we left it. We've got the different pages, the different languages, and I'm serving by default the British version there. But what we're going to do is we're going to add some more content in here. So before the news section, we're going to add some weather information, which is specific to me, to where I am, and we're going to use a couple of different things for that. We're going to use another freely available API. This is Open Weather. openweathermap.org. Again, these links will be in the repository, so if you want to follow along there, you can get access to those there as well. Once again, this is an API that you can certainly pay for, and if you're going to be using it in production, that's exactly what you should be doing. But for our purposes, for a demonstration, there is a free tier that gives us access to some APIs that we can start querying. Same kind of pattern to the news APIs we were using before, you'll need to just register, get an API key that then you'll be able to use in requesting things from the API. There's all kinds of things that we could be using from the API that's available to us. I'm just going to use the current weather data, and let's just look at the API for that. There's a bunch of different things that we might be able to do. We might be able to query for it based on the city name, or city name, state, also using country, or a city ID. What I'm going to go for is I'm going to use geographic coordinates. So we'll be using longitude and latitude. So we can, this is the format of the, but I'll open it up. Let's open this up here. So we pass in a lat long and an API key, and then we'll get this sort of data back. So we'll be able to start to use this data to embellish and enhance our site with some information about the location. In order to be able to do that, we need to be able to get the user's lat long information. And to do that, we'll be using JavaScript to talk to a browser API. Now, this is a browser API called geolocation, and there's a method on this API called getCurrentLocation, which is exactly what we need. Just popping down to the bottom of here on the MDN documentation site. This has got great browser compatibility, but we're still going to use some progressive enhancement just to check that it's available, just because it's good practice whenever you're using an API like this, just to make sure that you're using something that's available to whoever comes along to access it. A little note as well that this requires HTTPS. Now, we need to be making secure requests to our web server to be able to do lots of things that are interacting with browser APIs. This is for purposes of security and privacy, and so we need to be serving this over HTTPS. Fortunately, the environment that we're serving this from, this is HTTPS by default, and wherever you're hosting your sites from, this is something to look for, making sure that you can support a secure protocol for serving your sites. So much of the modern web depends on HTTPS, and it's just good practice to have that in place. But we don't have that currently in our local development environment, so I'm going to just comment in a second or two about how to get that set up. But let's just have a little look further at what using the geolocation API looks like. Well, here we are. We can make a request to the geolocation API, ask for the current position, and then this method accepts a couple of parameters: a success handler, an error handler, and we can pass in some options as well. So in a second, I'm going to steal this wholesale. But before I do, I just want to talk a tiny bit about making sure that we can view this locally in our local development environment without worrying the fact that we need HTTPS. So I'm just going to pop over, I think, to so I'm going to pop over back to, so here's our new project, our new folder, which is copied from our previous project. I'm just going to open up the code editor as we've been doing all along. This should be familiar from our previous examples, but the one thing we're just going to change to start with is our 11t config. You'll perhaps recall that we're running this script to build things. We're running our 11t script to build things. When we're developing locally, we're running this start script, which runs 11t serve. This is the thing that watches for changes, starts a simple web server, and then refreshes things for us. Internally, that's using something called browser sync, and by default, we haven't got that set to serve things over HTTPS. Now we can change this reasonably simply. There's a couple of steps to that. So let's look at the 11t config for this. Thankfully, 11t does support passing in some configuration for browser sync. So I'm going to do that now. I'm just going to paste this in from where I had it before. So this is another method that lives on 11t, set browser sync config. And we can pass in some various options. Here we're passing in something for HTTPS, which is an object that lets us define where our key and our certificate are. These are both resources that I've set up previously so that I could have HTTPS running on my local environment. It's probably just a bit out of scope of this this tutorial to talk about setting that up, but in terms of configuring 11t, this is all we'll have to do, but you are going to need to generate these things and trust those on your environment first of all. So what I'll do is I'm going to drop a couple of links into the README of the GitHub, the Git repository for this project, so you'll be able to step through those things and make sure you've got this up to speed. I'm just going to save that and make sure I'm able to use that as we go forward. So now, if I with these things in place, and assuming that you've created your certs and you set up this configuration, now when I start my little development server, I'm hoping what I should see is that the URLs for this, we have some HTTPS set up. So now when I open up my page, I'm serving that over HTTPS. So this is secure. So now this means that I'll be able to use those facilities within these facilities here to get access to the geolocation API. So let's do that next. Let's start adding from JavaScript to this. Well, I'm going to steal this. This is too good not to steal and then change. If we go back to our code, at the moment we're just including this one bit of JavaScript. This is all the client-side rendering we've got, just appending one of these strings. We're going to do a little bit more than that now. So let's create another file here. Let's call that weather. So I'm just going to stop my automatic build happening for the time being. Just paste all of this in. We don't need these options. We can have defaults. I think the default options will be fine. So I'm just going to simplify those by taking those out. But we do want to call this geolocation API to say get current position, and if this succeeds, then we'll start to get things like the latitude and longitude, and just log those out. I'm just going to save that. Now we haven't included this in our page anywhere yet, so let's see. I think just on our localized, this is a fairly rudimentary way of including the JavaScript. This is fine for our purposes. We might think of having some kind of build mechanic to munge these files together, or perhaps to create different packages and deliver those differently. But for our purposes, this is absolutely fine. So I'm just going to call that weather. Save that. And I think that should be enough to get us started. What I'll do before we continue, though, is I'm just going to trim down the number of pages we're creating, because I'm just conscious about how much we're hammering the API, making these 55 requests every time we reload. So I'm just going to reduce this down. Let's take a bunch of these out. There we are. We're only making a couple of requests to the API now. We could certainly be doing something a little bit more elegant here, such as caching that data, the data that's returned after one of these requests, and keeping that as another data file. And while we're in development mode, we might be just hitting that directly rather than requesting anything from the API at all. But I'm being a bit lazy in this example and just sticking with what we've done and not adding that complexity for now. But just for the moment, I'll just make these two requests. Okay, let's start this up. So if we open up our site, first of all, we're getting a message that we can't get the asset at the root of the site, and that's correct because we deleted our index file. We deleted that, and we were sending everything directly to the correct localized page. So we don't have that logic happening here in our dev environment. We've only implemented that up at the CDN. So if we go directly to our our page. Now I tested this a moment or two ago, so it hasn't prompted me for the location approval. You can see here actually I've allowed that already. So if we go to our if I go to our console, we should see, yeah, there we are. So we're starting to log out our console data. Great. Well, that's our first step. That's a good first step. I think it's important though that we just make a small change down here. We talked about doing progressive enhancement to make sure that we're not using features that maybe not every browser has. Navigator.geolocation has really good support, but nonetheless it's pretty good practice to just test for that. And we'll only make this request and go off and do this piece of activity if this is supported. There's a few other bits and pieces along the way that we'll do to make sure that we're not doing anything that will appear broken as we try and do this. But that's an important kind of first step whenever we're using browser features such as this. Okay, so at the moment we're getting our coordinate data, our lat long, but we're just spitting it out to the console. Let's make use of that now. Let's go and take a little look to remind ourselves about how the weather API uses this. Let's go back to the documentation for coordinates. Here we are. So this is the request that we're going to want to make. So let's pop that into our code. So let's just capture that first of all. Our URL that we're going to use is this. Oops. Let's add the protocol in. And we've got a few variables. Actually, this is kind of helpful. We might as well just use that as is. And API key. In fact, if we can call these directly, pos dot chords dot longitude. Okay, because that way we don't need to do anything else with these at all. In fact, we can get rid of this. And to make this request, what we'll do is we'll use fetch for this. So we'll fetch this URL, and then we'll take the response. Let's just transform that JSON. That, what are we going to do with that? That data. Well, for the moment, let's see what this data looks like that we're getting back from the API. Okay, looks good. Let's also make sure we've got API key. Now I've got that stashed somewhere. Okay, put that in. Now let's see what our browser is telling us as we give this a look. Great. Okay, so we're getting data back from the API. Let's have a little look at the shape of it. Okay, so it's got our lat long. The name is City and District of St Albans. Yes, that is indeed where I am in Great Britain. Weather, we've got mainly cloud, description broken clouds, an icon there as well. That seems about right. Temperature 280. Ooh, that seems a bit warm. I guess these. So it's returning the data, the temperature in Kelvin, which I don't usually use, but that's I guess we can probably transform that into Celsius. In fact, let's just double check. Let's see if we can find unit. Great, metric. Let's do that so that we don't have to speak Kelvin. And unit equals metric. Okay, let's have a little inspect now. Weather, main. There we are. Temperature 6 degrees. It's very precise. Okay, great. Well, we're getting some data that we can now make use of. So let's now get it into the site. Let's go back into our page, our template that where we're using it. So here's where we're displaying our news articles. Once again, I'm just gonna stop that automatically rebuilding just for the moment. Let's be a bit more descriptive in here. Let's put an H2 in here for news in your country. Let's have another little section up here where we're perhaps weather near you. What are we going to have? Let's think. Let's go back and have a quick look at the data. It's trying to reconnect to our live reloading, but we don't have that going now. So we've got the name for the city. We've got the temperature. A few other bits and pieces. Okay. Let's get those. Let's get those in. So give these a place to be displayed. Start with city. Let's have maybe 3 or 4 of these. City. Let's have the temperature. Let's say that main kind of status and maybe a bit more of a description. Let's start with those, and let's populate those in our weather. So we're going to want to do this rather than logging this out. So I will leave the logging just for the moment, but let's start appending this to the site. Great. Select. Let's say so. Our first one was city. Text content equals, and then we'll grab from the data. The first one was the name, I think, for the city. Let's just make a few of these. What did we have? We had temp, we had the main, we had the description, and this was main.temp. And this was in a as I recall, this is in a weather object. Weather as an array. For some reason, there's an array here of maybe there are different states, but we're just going to grab the first one. Let's grab the first one and the main and the description. Okay. So weather. Main. And we'll put the description in there as well. Okay. See how this looks. See if we're starting to get content flowing in. Give this another little reload. Okay, so you could see there's a bit of a flash of unstyled content, or unpopulated content rather, while we're making that request and going off and getting the data. But here we are, we're getting our data into the site. It's not super beautiful to look at, but it's descriptive and it's particular to me in my environment. So let's just make this a tiny bit nicer. Degrees. I think that's. Let's see if that's correct. Now, something else that we might want to do, since we were we're trying to use progressive enhancement here. We're trying not to make a call to this unless it's supported, but we do have now this thing on the page the whole time. So why don't we actually we'll wrap that in a div. And we'll give that an ID of weather, and we'll perhaps we'll style it initially. We'll hide this. That's a hidden class, and let's, and in our template that has the CSS, our minimal CSS, let's add a hidden class here with display none. Great. And then what we can do is we can remove that class once we've populated all of these things. So only if the request so first of all, only if this is supported will we make the request at all, and then only if we successfully get the data back, populate it all, will we remove that class list dot remove hidden. Great. So now if these things aren't supported at all, we won't be thinking we've got a failed page. Nice. Oh no, I didn't get my escaping right. Okay. And let's just try directly. Let's see how we get on here. Oh, okay, that did the job. I thought I'd need to escape that. Fine. All right. So, what status are we in here then? Now we've got pre-generated news information that's been localized for my country, and then this has been enhanced with some weather near me from a client-side API call. Now I could obviously be styling this up, and these could be some iconography and what have you, but we're just trying to prove a point at the moment. However, we do have a little bit of an issue in that this is our JavaScript that is being executed in the client. We've got our API key in here. We're making a request from the client to this API, which is sending our API key, over the wire, and it's coming down in the code to the browser. So anyone could inspect that, anyone could see that. Really, we want to squirrel that away. We'd rather have that somewhere private. Now, this is exactly why very often we'll introduce a server. We won't want to be sending these kind of requests directly from the client. We want to be doing something like this from a server. And even when it's something as simple as this kind of an API request, we might end up introducing server logic just so that we can create a proxy, or we can have this code being executed there. So perhaps what we should do is we should take this request away from the client, and let's create this in a server. But we don't want to do it. We don't want to introduce a server. Let's use a serverless function for this. We could certainly proxy this request through a serverless function, so that we don't need to be sending the API key in the wild, as it were. So how could we do that? Well, the easiest thing to think about here would be to create a Lambda function and then write our JavaScript in there. Fortunately, we can do that reasonably simply with Netlify functions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new folder here. We'll call it functions, and I'm going to create a JavaScript file in there called weatherapi.js. And if we go through this process and we deploy this to Netlify and tell Netlify that this is a serverless function, this will put it to Amazon Web Services as a Lambda function, and then set up all of the rules to do like the API gateway and all of the permissioning on our behalf. So we'll get an endpoint that we'll be able to just hit and run this. And this won't be running in our environment anymore. It'll be running as a serverless function. The question is, are serverless functions JAMstack? But perhaps we'll come to that at the end when we review about whether everything we did was JAMstack or not. But for the moment, let's write our serverless function. I'm actually going to cheat here and I'm just going to copy and paste in a function I've already written. Here we go. Now this is going to look very familiar. First of all, Axios. We were using Axios at the very beginning when we started pulling in, whereabouts is it? In our data, in our news data. Here we are. We're using Axios. We're making this Axios request to a feed there. We're going to use the same thing here in our serverless function. We're going to use Axios and then we'll make a request to it. A few things that maybe look a little bit different to what we've seen before. Well, first of all, we're exporting this handler function, and this is the function signature for a serverless function. We're using this asynchronously because we're going to await the response from this Axios get request. But we can, when we call a function this way, we get access to things like the query string parameters, and we can set a callback and what have you. So what we'll do here is we'll construct our URL. We'll want to put our lat long, just as we were doing client side in our JavaScript. We're going to pass in our weather API key. Now, once again, as we did before when we were requesting our news API, we were using an environment variable there. We'll do exactly the same thing here as well. So we'll pull out the lat long from our query string parameters, populate our URL, and then we'll make a request to that URL using Axios, await that response, and when we get the response, we'll send our response via a callback in the body of our response, sending our data back, and we'll just stringify that so it comes back as a string response for the client to handle. That's all there is happening here. It's 10 or 12 lines, something like that, when it's all there and included. We don't need to add another dependency because we're using a dependency that we already included in our package JSON. And when we deploy this to Netlify will kind of zip all of this code up with any of the requirements that it might have, any of its dependencies, and deploy that all for us. But we need to tell it to do that. I'm going to add another file in here called netlify.toml. And this is going to have a few bits of configuration for us based on what we want Netlify to do when it deploys the site for us. Now, here's a bit of boilerplate that I've already created. So this is going to happen at build time. You might recognize these from when we set up our site in the first place. We told Netlify what command to run when we want to build and which directory to publish. We can actually pop this in here so we wouldn't need to populate that manually. In fact, what I'll do is I'll add this to the code repository, so if you're cloning this and getting a site running, you won't need to populate this. But what we also need to do is we need to tell Netlify that we've got some functions that we'd like it to deploy for us as well, and tell Netlify where to find those. And I put those in source, and I used underscore so that 11t would ignore it, and then functions. That should do that, I think. Okay, so when we deploy that, we're going to end up with a URL with weather API in the URL that we'll be able to make our request there instead of making our request directly to the open weather API. So let's make a change there. In fact, we're not going to need this, but I'll capture that and I will add it to our .env file, so we'll be able to use that. At least keep track of it. Also go like this, just to be good for our semi-documentation. And we'll want to change our client-side API. Okay, so we can now be rid of that. What's the URL that we're going to send? Well, let's do away with all of this. So this is actually going to be relative to the root of the site we're serving from. Netlify has this little convention where any functions that you deploy will live in a functions folder, and then the file that we call it will become the path. So we call that weather API. So is that correct? Yep. Now we're still passing the lat long through, as we should, but I think from here on in we won't need, let's keep the units. Okay, so we can stop this building for the moment. So I think we should be in good shape there. I don't think we're going to need to change anything else. We're now sending the data to Netlify functions to get the response, doing exactly the same thing with the response when we get it. Let's give this a shot. Let's add all of our changes. Client side data and API, all of these things, and we'll push those. And let's go and watch things happening at the build. Let's just refresh this. Okay, so let's see how things are building. Should be able to see things like the functions being packaged up and our API being created for us. So it's getting its dependencies. I am still caching, logging out the data. As I said, I'd remove it. I promise I'll do that in a second. In fact, at the moment we're only requesting a couple of different pages. Here we are. So function directory found. So it's found our functions directory, and it's using a utility called zip it and ship it, which packages up all its dependencies and creates the functions. Good, that looks. So let's go and preview our deployment. There's our news pre-generated in there. Oh, and there's our data. Now it didn't ask me for permission. Full disclosure, I tested a little bit earlier on, so I've already granted the permission to get location on this URL. But this new deployment that seems to be working nicely. We should just have a couple of pages. Let's make that change. Just for the sake of tidying up after ourselves, I did say, first of all, let's replace all of those. And where was that logging? That would have been in the... Here we are. Let's take that little bit of logging out that's just been pestering me this entire time. Okay. Now we'll commit that, all pages. Push that to our repository, which of course will trigger another deployment. And we should be just about done. Let's look at our deploys, our new deployment running. Should be reasonably fast because we haven't got our cache to, we haven't got our dependencies to install. They've been cached. Yeah, restored from the cache. There we go. All of our pages being made without all of that logging. Our function being packaged up and sent across to where it needs to go. Post-processing finishing up. Let's go look at the site. Okay, great. So I should now be able to go to any one of these. Let's go to the Italian page, see the Italian news. I won't translate. And even though we've got the Italian localized content, we're getting the weather specific to me. And you'll have noticed that this headline, this title, wasn't present until all of the data was ready to render. Let's look at it on another page, see if we can look at that for Canada. Oh, it's happening very quickly. So the URL is the data is being returned quite quickly. Now, let's just sense check this. The code that is coming down the wire. We don't have any secrets in here. We're not sending any secrets down the wire. And at the point that we request the data, if we look at the network requests happening. Let's look at all the network requests. Yeah, so here's our network requests being made to our API being served by a serverless function, and there's no There are no secrets in here. So this is safe now. Excellent. We're in much better position. So let's just review for a moment. Let's just think about what's happening now. Now we've got a site that we've built where we're pre-generating at build time a whole host of pages based on data that we're getting from a third-party API. We're baking out different pages for each of the different locales at build time, and we're populating those all to a CDN. Then when a user comes along in their browser, they're making a request for that content. They're getting the data back instantly and getting the news information correct for their location, because the CDN has decided which bit of content to send them, which file to serve them back. And then once they've got that, we're using progressive enhancement with JavaScript to say, does the browser have access to the ability to look at location data? And if it does, request permission from the user to access that. And once that has been granted, make a request to another API, which is actually going to a serverless function that we've created ourselves as a proxy, still without any web servers involved, returning that data and then enhancing the view in the client with that data. We're in a position that we're using server-side rendering for the meat of it, but client-side rendering for some progressive enhancement and calling those different APIs. So where does that leave us? In terms of JAMstack, yes, we're pre-rendering these files. We're serving them directly from a CDN. And although we've got an API that we've now created ourselves, granted it's just a proxy, but it's still an API service that we're now maintaining as a function, we're still doing that without having the requirement to run a web server. So I think even with all of those things happening, was that JAMstack? Well, yeah, absolutely it was. It's worth thinking, I think, for a moment about the kind of sites that could use this kind of setup and this kind of flow. You could well imagine that the kind of page that we're pre-generating with all of the information that we know ahead of time could be things like product pages, where we want to make sure that search engines can easily get to them very quickly, get to the data very quickly, and then we might be embellishing through client-side APIs things like latest prices or stock levels or those sorts of things, or even starting to add authentication for the user and a shopping basket, all at this level, but based on product pages which have been built out ahead of time. Are serverless functions JAMstack? I think that's maybe debatable, because if we look at this definition of JAMstack, this is talking about pre-rendering files and pre-rendering assets. Serverless functions aren't really pre-rendering; those are happening at request time. But certainly they adhere to this part. They don't mean that you have to introduce a web server or manage a web server. I'd maybe say that strictly speaking, serverless functions aren't JAMstack, but certainly they are the JAMstack's best friend, and they are a big enabler for being able to build this kind of architecture, still being able to have APIs that you can create without needing to introduce servers and infrastructure and all those kind of things. Okay, I think that wraps us up for this example. Probably about time for a bit of a recap of what we've gone over so far. So what did we cover? Well, let's look just for a minute just at the examples that we've created. Along the way, what did we make? We've evolved one site from very humble beginnings, just a simple static site, just a single HTML file to begin with, served as a static asset, and indeed having a very static experience. But we've evolved that so much further than having a static experience. We started to use a small amount of JavaScript in the client to render some content. Admittedly, to start off with, very, very simplistic, but manipulating the DOM with JavaScript in the client, so client-side rendering in a very simplistic form, all served as static assets though. Then we moved on to adding some templating and abstraction with a static site generator, so we were able to run a very similar mechanic at build time to what a traditional website and web server environment would do per request, but we're doing it for every page, every route at build time, thanks to this static site generator, which allows us to apply templates to content which has been abstracted away to generate a site that we can place at a CDN for very, very efficient web hosting. Then we moved on to having content which we source from an API rather than just as part of the code base, so that at build time we could make a request to a content API, pull that content in and populate a page, again applying that to our templating so that we could generate as many pages as we needed from the source of content that we had as an external API. From there, we moved on a bit further, having localized content, all again rendered at build time, so that we could generate a pool of resources, each one localized, potentially in future internationalized for the different languages, different locales that might come to visit the site, deploying that to a CDN and then letting the CDN apply the logic of which file gets served to which user based on their conditions, whether they have their languages set to a certain language, or if they're arriving at the site from a particular place in the world. And then finally we added more client-side rendering and started to target the content to the user based on a query to the browser APIs and then to content APIs that were third-party content APIs. These things happening at request time, client-side, as a progressive enhancement to the key content that we'd pre-rendered ahead of time and served up as a localized set of content. So we've traveled a long, long way over the course of these 6 examples. The site we've built looks very visually simplistic, but it starts to demonstrate the different aspects of an architecture that can be driven with a JAMstack site, and it shows us the different forms of rendering and serving things that we could have. You know, we've seen that a JAMstack site, yes, is made up of JavaScript, APIs, and markup, but not all of them need to be present in order for a site to be JAMstack. The key isn't in having all of these things there. This really describes kind of the enablers that have let us move from a static experience to something way, way more dynamic. The thing that all of these sites have got in common is that yes, they're created to be fast and secure sites, but they're delivered by pre-rendering the files ahead of time so that we can serve them directly from a CDN, perhaps with a tiny bit of intelligence and logic there to elevate them even further. But critically, we don't have to have a web server. We've removed the requirement to manage a web server of our own, so that we've just got a far simpler hosting environment and a far simpler deployment experience and development experience, which all really should be in the betterment of a good user experience. We've created an environment which is far easier to reason about. You know, our deployment process is coupled to our version control and our process of building things, rather than coupled to the complex infrastructure needs that underlie the system. This kind of environment and this kind of flow is far easier to reason about, I'd argue, when really what we're concerning ourselves with, for the most part, is how we build, how we generate these pages so that they can deliver exactly the experience we need in the browser. You know, there's so much craft these days in front-end development that it's nice to concentrate our effort on building out the site and the code for the site that lives in the browser without having to worry about how it spans lots of different complex infrastructure and has to be hosted across these different assets and pieces of the hosting infrastructure. Everything is built and pushed to the CDN so that we can evolve that and use our version control all the way through to the CDN and our hosting environment. We can still be building APIs, and we can have third-party APIs or in-house APIs that we're using. But the beauty is that these are decoupled. These are no longer part of the same monolithic infrastructure. So now we can have teams building out our APIs that are purely building out our special sauce, our services that make our product and our applications distinct from our competitors. That can be decoupled from the experience that we're building in the front end, so that we can have different teams building to their specialisms and evolving the site along the way. The kind of key enablers that we've talked about along the way, I just want to reiterate again, the kind of automation, the tools and services, and this blossoming API economy really elevate things from where we used to be. You know, this is a really kind of blossoming world at the moment, and you know, this kind of growing ecosystem moves us so much beyond static. That's why this word static just doesn't cut it anymore. we're benefiting from being able to generate static resources that we can then host in the most efficient way. But the experiences we're making are so much more than static these days. This economy is just exploding. The JAMstack ecosystem. This is a visualization put together by Redpoint some time ago. In fact, the world is even bigger and more interesting now than it was when this was created. But we're already building, whether we're on a traditional stack or on the LAMP stack, using some of these tools and build mechanics to generate front ends. But now we can use these, uninhibited by the ecosystem, by the infrastructure and the development environment. We can really take ownership of that development environment and use this kind of decoupling of the different services, that we're using APIs for this kind of huge amount of headless CMSs that are just thriving now that we're seeing the move towards headless decoupled services. And there's so many utilities that we can make use of, whether that's for search or authentication or things like comments or form backends or communications or e-commerce. It's just really blossoming, and there are all of these services where companies are specializing in very complex, involved, difficult to build services, so you can just get all of their wisdom and all of their services outsourced and available right into your application. There are so many hosting environments and CDNs that are there for us to start to make use of, built with the use of version control and the different services there that we can leverage, all on top of this cloud infrastructure and this huge kind of opportunity for building on top of virtualized infrastructure that can get abstracted away as well. So the whole ecosystem is really thriving, and it's getting quite exciting. The difficult thing is to think about, well, how do we get there? How do we even start? Yes, we've worked through some simple examples, and we can see that building this out can be logically simple. But what if we're already in a situation where we have a lot of infrastructure already? How do we move from a big monolithic architecture across to starting to use the JAMstack? Well, I just kind of want to close by making the point that we don't need to do everything at once. We don't need to boil the ocean. If we've invested years and years of work and lots of money on some infrastructure which is already in place, but we want to start to take advantage of the JAMstack and move things across, we don't have to do a bulk move across of everything at once. And I want to demonstrate that just briefly as a final kind of demo, just by looking at an example. Now, this is CSS Tricks. This is one of my favorite resources on the web. It's an incredible set of articles, of resources to learn about web development. You may well have come across it. This is a WordPress site, and it's fantastic. I really am a big fan of it. CSS Tricks already has started to build one or two resources with the JAMstack. This is a site about web development and design conferences. It's a set of resources managed as an open source repository on a GitHub site. It lives on its own subdomain, so it's kind of abstracted away from the main WordPress site. Interestingly, it's using the same static site generator that we've been using in our demos, and it's served from, in this case, it's actually served from Netlify's hosting environment. I've got a little extension here that shows me when something's served from that environment. So this is a pre-rendered JAMstack site that sits very happily on its own subdomain next to CSS Tricks main site. This is a very common approach for when you want to start to introduce some aspects of your site that lend themselves well to being pre-generated, when this is a great example of that. But should we want to actually start, and I'm not suggesting that CSS Tricks are on this path, but let's just use this as a prominent, large WordPress example. If we wanted to start to introduce parts of this site that were served instead of from WordPress or some other legacy infrastructure, big monolithic infrastructure perhaps, how might we start going about doing that? Well, I want to show you a little demo where I'll build out a version of this where I'm just going to start to take over certain parts of the site. And we've already actually looked at some of the mechanics that we'll need to do this. I've created this tiny little example demo site. I'm going to use this as the source of of what we're going to demonstrate, just as this little final demo. And what we're going to do, I mean, you can see the only resources that are in this site, which we're going to clone and create as a new site of our own in just a second. There's only two assets. There's the README, which is just for here, so we get a little button to make it easier to deploy, and a redirects file. And we've seen one of those already. We were generating that ourselves with our build. Now, this redirects file only has one entry in it. Something I perhaps should have mentioned sooner while talking about redirects is, unless you force these rules to happen, they will only occur if the route that we're looking for doesn't resolve to a resource, a statically built out resource. So we can force that by just using an exclamation mark, adding a bang to the rule. But otherwise, a static asset will take precedence. But in this case, we know we don't have anything else in the site at all. It's just, there is no HTML. There's just our redirects. And the redirects says, unless there's a static asset to satisfy the request, all requests from the root will be rewritten. We'll use a proxy to rewrite any one of those requests to this destination. It will go to the CSS Tricks existing site, and then we'll use this splat to take whatever the wildcarded request was and pass that through. That's all that we're doing. So let's make a new site from this. So doing what I've been doing behind the scenes many times before during these demos, just creating a new site. I'm going to call that freeCodeCamp proxy demo, just for the sake of having a repository name that we can identify. So this is now cloning that little example repo into a new repo that I can then make some changes to as well. Okay, so that cloning is done, and now it'll kick off a deployment. This deployment should happen pretty rapidly because there are no assets to deploy to a CDN. All it's doing is adding this one redirects rule. So let's take a look at what that looks like. If we go to our site now, well, it looks exactly like the existing infrastructure. It looks exactly like CSS Tricks. This request has gone via Netlify. It's gone via the CDN that we've configured. And all of the pages are being served from our new site, from this new domain that we've created, this subdomain. Of course, we could have this as a custom domain as well. All of the resources, all of the pages, all of the assets are being served in exactly the same way. But we don't currently have any code of our own that we're serving. So let's change that. Let's perhaps take over this homepage and start to make changes. An example. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to steal it. Let's just do a view source on the page, and we'll copy all of that, and perhaps we'll change this headline. So let's go back to our repository. So this is our new repository that we created. It's just a clone of the one that was there before. But now let's create a new file. Let's start to build out a file. Well, we're not having any complex build infrastructure here. We're manually creating a file. Here we are. So why don't we just change something so that we can see we're serving our own site. freeCodeCamp demos are a go. Okay, and now we'll save this by committing this new file. There we are. So now our site has this. Now we might be building this out, with a much more complex build, or something similar to what we had before. But for the moment, we just have this one index file. And if we go back across to our new site, we should see. If I just refresh the deploys page, we should see. Okay, we've got a new deploy that's been done. We've uploaded one new file. So now when we go to the site, our homepage should be, okay, so we've taken over this homepage now. So now we're serving this page with our new index.html file. This resource was a hit when we went to our CDN and the traffic went there. All of the assets that are on here are still being served from the same places. All of the following pages are still served from the same places. Those aren't a hit on our CDN, so those are being proxied through. So you can start to imagine that just with adding things like redirect rules so that you can decide where you route your traffic to, you can start introducing layers of Jamstack sites in front of your existing infrastructure really, really quickly. I think that's incredibly powerful, and it kind of shows that we don't need to try to boil the ocean. The first step doesn't need to be a giant leap. We can gradually introduce Jamstack sites alongside our existing infrastructure, and that's incredibly liberating when we're starting to look at either the move from one bit of infrastructure to another or introducing a new model. I'm really excited about the prospects of building things ahead of time and letting the CDN manage the serving of those for me in a way that I don't have to manage. So I think let's just leave with a link, a bunch of resources. You've been through now all of these 6 examples. Each of these examples has its own repository that you can inspect, look at, you can clone, you can deploy yourself so you can experiment with it as well. And those all find that at Jamstack X1 through to X6. There's also a link for freeCodeCamp. Find that at Jamstack FCC, which is a set of links to all of these resources and a few other bits and pieces alongside. You might also be interested in seeing that there's a book about Jamstack. So myself and one of the co-founders at Netlify have written a book about web development on the Jamstack, and you can find that at Jamstack Book. And finally, if you want to ask more questions and get in touch with people who are building things with the Jamstack now, talking about Jamstack and all things to do with this new way of leveraging the Jamstack ecosystem, discovering APIs, learning about all the different systems and bringing that all together, there is a Slack as well. It's an open Slack where you can join the conversations, find out things about things like the Jamstack conference and different meetups. Find that at Jamstack Slack. So these are all good resources to take a note of. The one in particular is the /FCC, where you'll also find all of these other links and what have you. So that's it. I hope that was useful. Those links are all there ready for you to explore. So if you want to go and experiment with any of the demonstrations that are there, you can clone those repositories, deploy them for yourselves, start tinkering with the code and exploring how to use those. Also, please do come and join us in the Jamstack Slack. There's lots of good conversation in there. Links were there on the screen a moment ago, and you can find a link to all of these things. Find that at Jamstack/FCC. So that's all. Thanks for watching.